Across the ash-gray wastes of Metallus-VII, 10,000 souls screamed their final prayers to a corpse god, while La's fire painted the smoke-choked sky in crimson streaks. The Astra Militarum, 88th Cadian Regiment, had held this position for 6 weeks against the Ork Waaagh, that had crashed upon the Forge World like a green tide of violence and scrap metal. Colonel Artemis Vane stood in the command trench, his augmetic eye tracking the greenskin horde as it surged forward once more, a living wall of tusks, rage, and crude ballistic weapons. All units fix bayonets, he roared into the Voxcaster. For the Emperor, for Cadia. Cadia stands, the regiment answered in unison, even though their homeworld had been swallowed by the Eye of Terror years ago. Even though they knew in their hearts that this world would fall, that they would all die here, ground beneath the boots of Xeno's filth, or incinerated when the Mechanicus finally admitted defeat and called for exterminatus. But they would die well. They would die as Cadians. The sky tore open. Not metaphorically, not gradually. The fabric of reality simply split, a wound in the universe that bled colors without names and geometries that made the human mind recoil in instinctive horror. The tear hung above the battlefield like a gangrenous wound, 50 meters across, pulsing with an energy that felt wrong on every conceivable level. The fighting stopped. Orcs and humans alike stared upward at the impossible sight. Even the greenskins, creatures whose lives revolved around violence and whose brains could not process complex fear, felt something primal crawl up their spines. Mechbais muttered prayers to Gork and Mork. Cadians gripped their lasguns tighter, decades of training screaming that this was warp-born, that this was heresy made manifest. Colonel Vane's augmetic eye clicked through spectrum filters, trying to make sense of the anomaly. Thermal nothing. Auspex nothing. Even his picture recorder displayed only static, as if reality itself refused to acknowledge what hung in the sky. Psyker, he hissed into the Vox. Psyker Mendel, report. What in the throne's name is that? The Vox crackled. When Psyker Third Class Jeremiah Mendel's voice finally came through, it was thin, reedy, trembling with an emotion Vane had never heard from the normally stoic Psyker. Pure undiluted terror. Colonel, that's not the warp. That's not, I don't know what that is. It's wrong. It tastes wrong. It feels like Emperor preserve us, it feels like a curse. And then something fell through. No, not fell. Stepped. A figure emerged from the tier as casually as a nobleman stepping through a doorway. And the universe screamed. Sukuna's thoughts twist with amusement. Interesting. That was Ryomen Sukuna's first thought as he materialized in this new reality, his 4 arms folding across his chest as he surveyed the scene below. His second mouth, the one that bisected his torso, curved into a smile that would have sent shivers down the spines of sorcerers who had spent lifetimes mastering fear. Very interesting indeed, Sukuna's thought. The cursed energy here was different, thinner, almost non-existent actually, but there was something else, something that pressed against his consciousness like a massive, writhing ocean of raw emotion and power. It reminded him of cursed energy, that delicious cocktail of negative human emotion crystallized into power, but it was wilder, more chaotic, more alive. A new playground, he thought, his main mouth splitting into a grin that showed far too many teeth. How delightful. He took a moment to observe the battlefield below. Thousands of small creatures, humans by the look of them, though they wore strange armor and carried primitive energy weapons, locked in combat with larger, green-skinned brutes that stank of fungus and violence. Both sides had frozen, staring up at him with expressions that ranged from confusion to horror. Good, they should be terrified. Sukuna had existed for over 1,000 years in his original world. He had been sealed, true, but even imprisoned he had been conscious, aware, plotting. He had consumed so many sorcerers, so many humans, absorbed so many cursed techniques that he had become something beyond mortal comprehension. The king of curses, they had called him, the fallen one, the disgraced one. He preferred king. And now through some cosmic jock, or perhaps the machinations of something even he didn't fully understand, he had been ripped from that reality and deposited here. The transition had been painful, even for him. His cursed energy had been strained, stretched across dimensions, and for a brief moment he had felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. Vulnerability. But that moment had passed. His power had stabilized, his four-armed form reconstituting itself perfectly. And now, as he hovered above this pathetic battlefield, he felt that old, familiar hunger rising in his chest. Let's see what this universe has to offer, he thought, and descended. From third-person viewpoint, Sukuna landed in the center of no man's land with an impact that sent a shockwave rippling outward, dust and ash erupting in a perfect circle. The ground beneath his feet cracked, spiderwebbing out for dozens of meters. When the dust settled, the figure stood fully revealed. He was massive, easily over 2 meters tall, his body sculpted from muscle that seemed more like carved stone than flesh. Pink hair framed a face marked with intricate black tattoos that formed patterns too complex to follow, too perfect to be accidental. 4 arms, each ending in clawed hands that looked capable of rending ceramic. A second face on his torso, its mouth grinning with predatory satisfaction. But it was the eyes that truly captured attention. 4 red orbs that blazed with an intelligence and cruelty that made even the most hardened warriors want to look away. Eyes that had watched civilizations burn and laughed at the ashes. Contact, Colonel Vane's voice cracked over the Vox. All units target that thing, fire at will. 1,000 lasguns opened up simultaneously. The air filled with crimson beams of coherent light, each one capable of punching through reinforced plasteel, each one aimed with Cadian precision at center mass. Sukuna stood perfectly still and let them hit him. The law's fire splashed against his skin like rain. Some of the shots struck his tattoos and seemed to simply stop, absorbed by patterns that glowed briefly before fading. Others hit flesh and burned, leaving small scorch marks that healed almost instantaneously. The King of Curses tilted his head, studying the weapons with the same curiosity a scientist might show when examining a particularly interesting insect. "Pathetic," he said, and his voice carried across the battlefield despite the roar of gunfire. It was a voice that seemed to resonate on multiple frequencies at once, a sound that made teeth ache and hearts skip beats. "Is this the best this world has to offer?" He raised one hand, fingers splayed, and spoke a single word. "Cleave." The air itself seemed to tear. An invisible blade of pure cursed energy, sharp enough to split atoms, wide enough to encompass the entire Cadian battle line, swept across the battlefield in a horizontal arc. There was no warning, no buildup, just sudden, catastrophic violence. 247 guardsmen died instantly. They didn't explode, they didn't burn, they simply separated, top halves sliding from bottom halves with surgical precision, blood and organs spilling onto the ash-gray ground in a grotesque exhibition of anatomy. Some of them were still screaming as their upper bodies toppled, still trying to process what had happened, still attempting to fire their lasguns even as their legs collapsed independently. The orcs who had been watching this exchange with growing excitement roared with approval. This was proper violence. This was the kind of carnage that made Gork and Mork smile. They charged. Sukuna's grin widened. Dismantle. This time the cursed technique was different. Instead of one large slash, Sukuna created dozens, hundreds of small, precise cuts. Each one targeted specific points, joints, arteries, structural weak points in armor. The charging orc mob, 300 strong, came apart like poorly assembled toys. Arms separated from shoulders, heads tumbled from necks, torsos split along perfectly straight lines. It was butchery elevated to an art form, violence so precise and controlled that it transcended mere killing and became something almost beautiful in its horror. The orcs died without understanding what had killed them. Their primitive brains couldn't process the concept of an attack with no visible source, no projectile, no blade. They simply charged forward and then weren't anymore. Sukuna walked through the carnage, his feet splashing in rivers of blood from two different species, his face split in an expression of mild interest. He reached down and plucked up a severed orc head, examining it with the curiosity of a child who had found an interesting rock. Fungoid biology, he mused, speaking to no one in particular. Fascinating, and you humans. He turned to where Colonel Vane stood, frozen in horror. Your family. Ire at least, though these weapons of yours are disappointingly weak. The colonel, to his credit, found his voice. In the name of the God Emperor of mankind, I command you to. Command, Sukuna laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with screaming. You command me, you who couldn't even scratch my skin with your primitive light weapons, you who are so weak that I could erase your existence with a thought. He flicked one finger. Colonel Artemis Vane, 30-year veteran of the Astra Militarum, survivor of 6 major campaigns, decorated hero of the Imperium, exploded. Not in fire, not in gore. He simply came apart, every molecule in his body suddenly deciding it would rather be somewhere else. Where he had stood, there was now only a fine red mist that slowly settled onto the ash. The remaining guardsmen broke. They ran. Discipline, training, centuries of conditioning, none of it mattered in the face of this. They had fought orcs and tyrannids and even chaos cultists. But this was something their minds couldn't categorize, couldn't fight, couldn't even properly comprehend. They ran and Sukuna let them. Not out of mercy. He simply found the act of hunting scattered prey boring. Instead, he closed his eyes and felt the energy of this universe. That strange, writhing ocean he had sensed earlier was everywhere, pressing against reality like an enormous parasite. It pulsed with emotion, rage, desire, despair, hope, ambition, decay. Every feeling he had ever tasted in cursed energy, magnified a trillionfold and mixed into a churning sea of pure chaos. So that's what this is, he thought, his grin returning. A dimension of pure emotion. How wonderfully efficient. No need to wait for curses to form naturally. They're already here, already infinite, already feeding on the fear of trillions. He opened his eyes and looked toward the horizon, where he could sense the densest concentrations of human life. Cities, billions of souls, each one generating that delicious emotional energy. I think, Sukuna said to the empty battlefield, littered with the remains of over 500 beings who had been alive minutes ago, I'm going to enjoy this universe very much. He began walking. Behind him, the tear in reality slowly closed, healing like a wound, until no evidence remained of his arrival except for the corpses and the survivors who would wake up screaming every night for the rest of their mercifully short lives. For a psyker of third-class Jeremiah Mendel who had pissed himself. He wasn't ashamed to admit it. Any psyker worth their salt would have done the same after sensing what he had just sensed. He crouched in the ruins of a chimera transport, his hands pressed against his temples, his psychic hood's neural interfaces firing so rapidly they were starting to burn his scalp. The pain was welcome. It gave him something to focus on other than the wrongness that had just walked across the battlefield. As a psyker, Jeremiah was trained to sense the warp. He had been tested, sanctioned, soul-bound to the Emperor himself in a ceremony that had left him permanently marked. He could feel demons approaching, could taste chaos corruption in the air, could sense psyker activity from kilometers away. This creature, wasn't any of that. It didn't feel like the warp. The warp was hot and cold simultaneously, a pressure and a void madness given form. It was chaotic, yes, but it was chaotic in predictable ways. Demons followed certain patterns. Warp storms had signatures. Even the most insane chaos sorcerer still operated according to rules, even if those rules were antithetical to sanity. This was different. When Jeremiah had reached out with his psychic senses to probe the tier in reality, he had touched something that made his soul recoil. It wasn't the warp. It was adjacent to the warp, maybe, running parallel to it. It felt like cursed energy, though that term had appeared in his mind unbidden, with no context or explanation, concentrated and weaponized to a degree that seemed impossible. And the entity that had emerged from that tier. Jeremiah whimpered, pressing harder against his temples. He had touched that consciousness for less than a second before yanking his psychic presence back, but that second had been enough. He had felt endless hunger, bottomless cruelty, intelligence sharp enough to cut, amusement at the suffering of others, power that made greater demons look like children playing with sparklers. "Emperor, preserve us," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What have you sent to test us?" He needed to report this. The Inquisition needed to know. The Grey Knights needed to know. The Imperium needed to know that something had arrived in their universe that was neither chaos nor Xenos, but somehow worse than both. Jeremiah fumbled for his Voxcaster, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it twice. He keyed in the M. Urgency frequency, the one reserved for psychic threats of the highest magnitude. "This is Psyker 3rd Class Jeremiah Mendel, 88th Cadian Regiment, broadcasting on emergency channel Omega-7. I am reporting a category." A category. He paused. What category was this? Omega was for greater demon incursions. Apocalypse was for full chaos invasions. Extremis was for Xenos extinction-level threats. There wasn't a category for this. "Category unknown threat manifestation," he finally managed. "Requesting immediate inquisitorial intervention. Coordinates follow. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not." Something touched his mind. Jeremiah froze. The Voxcaster fell from his nerveless fingers. The presence was back. That consciousness that felt like sharpened glass and aged wine and fire that burned cold. It had noticed him. It had noticed his psychic presence and decided to investigate. "Ah," a voice echoed in his head, speaking directly into his thoughts with casual contempt. "So this universe does have something resembling sorcerers. How quaint." "Gee, get out," Jeremiah whimpered, throwing up every psychic defense he had been trained to use. Wards carved into his mind by the Emperor's own power. Mental fortresses built from decades of discipline. Mantras and prayers and holy scriptures. They might as well have been tissue paper. The presence tore through his defenses like they weren't even there, not with effort but with the casual ease of someone brushing aside a curtain. It rifled through his memories, his knowledge, his very soul with the same disinterest a bored noble might show when examining a servant's belongings. "The warp," the voice mused, "so that's what you call it. An ocean of souls and emotions churning in a dimension adjacent to reality. Demons, sentient manifestations of negative emotion. Gods who feast on worship and suffering. And you're a psyker, someone who can touch that ocean without immediately being consumed. How useful." Jeremiah screamed, not from pain, though there was pain. Oh yes, his neurons were firing in patterns they had never been designed for, but from the sheer violation of having his mind laid bare like a dissected frog. The presence withdrew, and Jeremiah collapsed, blood trickling from his nose and ears. His psychic hood was smoking, several neural interfaces having burned out completely. But he was alive. The thing had examined him, learned everything it wanted to know, and then simply left, like he wasn't even worth killing. Jeremiah lay in the wreckage of the Chimera, twitching, as his mind tried to rebuild the mental fortresses that had been so casually destroyed. He could still feel it out there, that terrible presence, walking away from the battlefield toward the cities where billions of humans lived and worked and prayed to their emperor. "Emperor, protect us," he whispered again, the words more prayer than statement. But in his heart, in the parts of his soul that the presence had touched and examined and dismissed, Jeremiah knew the truth. The emperor couldn't protect them from this. Nothing could. In the mind of Sukuna, curiosity and cruelty intertwine. Fascinating. Sukuna continued walking across the ash wastes, his pace leisurely, as he processed the information he had just extracted from that psyker's mind. The process had been simple, far simpler than it should have been actually. In his original world, reading someone's soul required either consuming them or using specific cursed techniques. Here, he had simply reached out with his cursed energy, touched the psychic presence and pulled. The information came flooding in. So this warp is essentially a massive repository of cursed energy, he thought, one hand idly crushing a piece of scrap metal that had once been part of an orc vehicle. Except instead of being generated by individual curses and negative emotions, it's an entire dimension fueled by the emotions of trillions of souls across the galaxy. Every fear, every hate, every desperate prayer feeding into an infinite ocean. It was, he had to admit, impressive. Inefficient, certainly. Most of that emotional energy was wasted, dissipating into the chaos rather than being focused and weaponized, but impressive in sheer scale. And these demons are manifestations of that energy, he continued, his analytical mind already categorizing and organizing. Sentient curses, essentially, but on a scale I've never encountered. Powered by worship and fear and emotion, capable of manifesting in reality under certain conditions. He could feel the warp now, pressing against the material universe like a massive tumor. It had always been there, of course, but now that he knew what to look for, it was impossible to ignore. He could sense the currents, the eddies, the places where the barrier between reality and unreality grew thin. And the humans of this universe have learned to tap into it. These psykers are essentially sorcerers who channel warp energy instead of cursed energy. Crude, dangerous, likely to be consumed by what they're using, but functional. Sukuna's grin widened. In his original world, he had been the undisputed master of cursed energy. He had consumed so many cursed techniques, absorbed so many abilities that he had become something transcendent. His domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine, was proof of that, a technique so powerful it could affect reality itself within its bounds. But this universe offered something his old world never could. Unlimited potential. The warp was infinite. The cursed energy here, no, the warp energy, was endless, constantly replenished by the suffering of trillions. If he could learn to tap into it, to bend it to his will the same way he had mastered cursed energy. I could become a god, he thought, and the idea didn't seem like hubris. It seemed like simple fact, not one of these pathetic chaos gods feeding on scraps of emotion like parasites. A true god, something new, something this universe has never seen. He had eternity to experiment. He had power beyond anything these humans could comprehend. And now he had a new playground. Sukuna threw back his head and laughed, and the sound echoed across the ash wastes like thunder. Several kilometers away, the surviving guardsmen heard that laugh and ran faster. Location: Hive City in Furnace, Metallus-VII. 7 hours after Sukuna's arrival. The Chaos Sorcerer called himself Malthius the Twiceborn, and he was having a very good day. The ritual had gone perfectly. 333 souls sacrificed in the correct pattern, their blood painting the 8-pointed star across the floor of this abandoned manufactorum. The warp had responded beautifully, tearing open a small portal through which his patrons' gifts could flow. Already, he could feel the power coursing through him, mutations flowering across his flesh like obscene roses. His cult stood around him in a circle, their faces hidden behind masks that depicted screaming demons, their robes stained with blood both fresh and old. They chanted in the dark tongue, words that made reality flinch, and Malthius felt his consciousness expanding, touching the Imperium, drinking deep of power that would have instantly destroyed a lesser mind. "Yes," he hissed, his voice now carrying harmonics that shouldn't be possible with human vocal cords. "Yes, Lord Tzinch, Architect of Fate, I am your vessel, I am your—" The door exploded inward. Not opened, not knocked down. Exploded, the reinforced adamantium torn apart like wet paper. Through the smoke and debris walked a figure that made Malthius's newly expanded consciousness recoil in confusion. This wasn't an Inquisitor. It wasn't a Space Marine. It wasn't anything his patron's visions had warned him about. Sukuna surveyed the scene with 4 red eyes, taking in the ritual circle, the cultists, the small tear in reality that led to the warp. His nose wrinkled slightly. "Amateurs," he said, and the single word carried more contempt than most beings could pack into an entire speech. Malthius recovered quickly, calling on his newfound power. Warp fire erupted around his hands, purple flames that burned without heat, that consumed soul rather than flesh. He had killed a space marine with these flames. He had burned an Arbite's precinct to ash. He was powerful, blessed by the changer of ways himself. "You dare interrupt a holy ritual," he snarled, his voice now layered with demonic resonance. "You dare profane the work of the—" Sukuna moved. The King of Curses crossed the distance between them in less time than it took for Malthius's augmented brain to process the motion. One moment he was at the door. The next, he was standing directly in front of the sorcerer, one clawed hand wrapped around Malthius's throat, lifting him off the ground with casual ease. "You talk too much," Sukuna observed. "Let's see what you actually are under all that bluster." He squeezed. Not physically. Malthius's throat remained intact, but Sukuna reached out with his cursed energy, bypassed flesh and bone, and grasped the sorcerer's soul directly. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Sukuna had consumed countless souls in his time, had ripped apart sorcerers and innocents alike to add their power to his own. But this was different. This soul was contaminated, corrupted. It tasted of the warp, of that churning ocean of chaos he had sensed earlier, but filtered through a specific lens. Change, Sukuna realized. Ambition, schemes within schemes. This creature has touched something in the warp that embodies those concepts, and it's marked his soul like a brand. Fascinating. The cultists, frozen in shock until now, finally reacted. They drew weapons, a mix of auto guns, las guns, and items that crackled with poorly caught. Rolled warp energy and opened fire. Sukuna didn't even look at them. Cleave. The invisible blade swept out in a perfect circle, and 37 cultists died simultaneously, bisected at the waist. Their upper bodies toppled forward, still clutching their weapons, while their legs remained standing for a moment before collapsing. Malthius struggled in Sukuna's grip, calling on every ounce of power his patron had granted him. Warp fire erupted from his skin. His flesh began to transform, bone spurs erupting, additional eyes opening across his body, tentacles sprouting from his back. He was becoming something more than human, something touched by divine madness. Sukuna watched the transformation with clinical interest. "So this is what happens when you let that chaos energy into your body," he mused. "Uncontrolled mutation, random power increases. Your soul is being rewritten by something external, remade in the image of—" What did that psyker call them? Chaos gods. He reached out with his cursed energy and pushed. Malthius screamed. The mutation stopped, reversed, fled back into his body as if repelled by something even more terrible than they were. The warp fire guttered and died. The demonic resonance in his voice vanished, leaving only a very human shriek of agony. Sukuna's domain, not fully expanded, not the malevolent shrine in its complete glory, but a miniature version, a bubble of pure cursed energy projected from his body, pressed against Malthus's corrupted soul like a hot iron against ice. This is fascinating, Sukuna thought, his analytical mind racing. The warp energy and my cursed energy are interacting. Not harmoniously, they're fundamentally opposed in some way, but they're interacting. And when I apply enough pressure, Malthus's soul began to crystallize. In his original universe, souls were complex, multifaceted things. They could be corrupted by curses, strengthened by resolve, shattered by trauma. But they remained fundamentally fluid, changing with experience and emotion. This warp-touched soul was different. It had been remade by exposure to that ocean of chaos, restructured along new lines. And when Sukuna's cursed energy pressed against it, something unexpected happened. The warp energy began to stabilize. It was like watching a chemical reaction. The chaotic, swirling power that had been transforming Malthus's flesh suddenly became ordered, crystalline, fixed. The mutations stopped not because they had been reversed, but because the energy fueling them had been frozen in place, locked into a stable state. Interesting, Sukuna thought, and his grin widened. Very interesting indeed. Malthus was still screaming. His body was stuck halfway through the transformation, tentacles froze in mid-emergence, eyes locked half open, bone spurs jutting at odd angles. He looked like a sculpture of someone becoming a demon, captured at the moment of change. "Tell me," Sukuna said conversationally, "these chaos gods you worship, where are they, what are they, how do they function?" Malthus gibbered something that might have been words. His mind, already fragile from exposure to warp corruption, was breaking under the dual pressure of his frozen transformation and the sheer wrongness of Sukuna's presence. Sukuna sighed, disappointing. He reached deeper into Malthus's soul, past the corrupted outer layers, past the false memories and implanted visions his patron had used to control him, down to the core where the sorcerer's true self still existed, shriveled and terrified. And there, Sukuna found something valuable. Knowledge. Malthus had studied the warp for decades. He had learned the true names of demons, had mapped the currents of the Imperium, had bargained with entities that existed beyond time and sanity. All of that knowledge was written into his soul, encoded in ways that would survive even death. Sukuna pulled it all out like a fisherman hauling in a net. The sensation was painful for both of them. Malthus's screams reached a pitch that shattered every piece of glass in the manufactorum. His body began to come apart, unable to handle the double trauma of his frozen transformation and having his soul flayed open. But Sukuna was patient. He took his time, ensuring he extracted every scrap of useful information before the sorcerer expired. Finally, when Malthus was nothing but a twitching husk barely clinging to life, Sukuna released him. The body collapsed to the floor, still partially transformed, still frozen in that moment between human and demon. Sukuna stood in the center of the ritual circle, surrounded by corpses, processing the information he had stolen. The warp is divided, he realized. 4 major currents, each embodying a specific concept: blood and war, plague and despair, change and ambition, excess and pleasure. And each current has a consciousness, a gestalt entity that's formed from trillions of souls feeding the same basic emotions into the immaterium. In other words, the biggest, most powerful curses imaginable. The chaos gods, Sukuna thought, rolling the term around in his mind. Korn, Nurgle, Tzinch, Slaanesh. Not true gods, they're dependent on worship and emotion to exist, but powerful enough that they might as well be gods by any practical definition. He looked down at the ritual circle, at the small tear in reality that still pulsed with warp energy. It was closing now, without Malthus to sustain it, but slowly enough that Sukuna could examine it. He crouched down, bringing his face close to the tier, and looked. Beyond the thin fabric of reality, he could see the warp in its true form, an ocean of screaming color and impossible geometry. Currents of emotion given physical form, or as physical as anything could be in a realm where physics were merely suggestions. He could see demons in there, entities of pure thought and hunger, circling like sharks attracted to blood. They could sense him too. He felt their attention turn his way. Thousands of alien consciousnesses suddenly focused on the tier in reality, trying to understand what was looking back at them. Hello, Sukuna thought, not speaking the words but projecting them with his cursed energy. The warp recoiled. For a brief moment, the ocean of chaos stilled. The demons fled. Even the fundamental currents of the Imperium seemed to pull back, as if the very fabric of that dimension had encountered something it couldn't categorize, couldn't absorb, couldn't corrupt. Then the moment passed. The warp surged back, enraged, trying to pour through the tier and consume this thing that had dared to look at it without fear or worship or madness. Sukuna smiled and activated his domain. Domain expansion, malevolent shrine. In his original world, this technique was death incarnate. It created a pocket dimension where Sukuna's cursed techniques were guaranteed to hit, where his power was absolute, where escape was impossible. Here, without the familiar framework of cursed energy to build on, he wasn't sure it would work properly. He needn't have worried. The domain expanded from his body like a shockwave, a sphere of pure cursed energy that overwrote reality itself within its bounds. The Manufactorum disappeared. The corpses disappeared. Even the warp tier flickered, struggling to maintain its existence within a space where Sukuna's will was absolute. And for approximately 10 seconds, something impossible happened. The warp stabilized. Within the bounds of his domain, that churning ocean of chaos became ordered. The currents straightened. The demons trying to force their way through the tier found themselves unable to move, frozen in place like insects in amber. Even the fundamental nature of the Imperium shifted, becoming less like an ocean and more like a carefully organized grid. Sukuna laughed in delight. So my cursed energy does interact with the warp, he thought. Not as fuel, they're fundamentally incompatible for that, but as a stabilizing force. My domain creates order where the warp is chaos, structure where it is formlessness, rules where it has none. He could feel the warp pushing back, trying to reassert itself. This wasn't sustainable. Maintaining his domain took enormous amounts of cursed energy, and fighting against an entire dimension was draining him faster than he would have liked. But it worked. That was the important part. It was possible. He released the domain, and reality snapped back. The warp tier closed with an audible pop, cutting off the demons that had been trying to force their way through. The Manufactorum returned, looking exactly as it had before except for the circle of pristine floor where his domain had been active. Even the bloodstains had been erased. Sukuna stood in the center of that circle, his mind racing with possibilities. If I can stabilize the warp on this small scale, he thought, asterisk then with enough time, enough power, enough understanding, I could stabilize larger areas, regions, planets, perhaps even carve out a section of the Imperium itself and claim it as mine. Asterisk, the idea was intoxicating. In his original world, he had been the strongest, but he was still limited by the fundamental laws of reality. Here, in a universe where reality was malleable, where emotion could literally reshape dimensions, where gods were real and could be killed, here, there were no limits. Well then, Sukuna said to the empty room, stepping over Malthus's twitching corpse, I suppose I should learn more about these chaos gods. If I'm going to kill them, I should at least know their names. He walked out of the Manufactorum, leaving behind a scene that would haunt the first inquisitorial investigator who found it for the rest of his life. 37 bisected corpses arranged in a perfect circle, around a half-transformed sorcerer whose soul had been so thoroughly violated that even servitor conversion was impossible. Behind Sukuna, written in Malthus's blood on the wall, though no one had seen him write it, were 3 words in perfect Gothic: "I am coming." So this universe operates on emotion, Sukuna thought as he walked through the lower levels of Hive City in Furnace, ignoring the terrified crowds that parted before him like water. Fear, hate, rage, desire, all of it feeding into that massive dimension adjacent to reality. The stronger the emotion, the more it influences the warp. The more it influences the warp, the more power those who can tap into it possess. It was elegant in a way. Inefficient, as he'd noted before, but elegant. In his original world, cursed energy came from negative emotions, but it had to be concentrated, usually through death or suffering, to become truly useful. Here, every single being with a soul was constantly feeding the warp simply by existing, by feeling, by experiencing. No wonder their gods are so powerful, he mused. They're not creating the energy, they're just collecting it. Parasites feeding on an endless buffet. He could sense the warp more clearly now after his examination of Malthus's soul and his brief interaction with that tier in reality. It pressed against the material universe like an enormous pressure differential, always trying to bleed through, always searching for weak points. And weak points were everywhere. Psychers were obvious ones. Their ability to channel warp energy made them natural conduits, and poorly trained psychers were essentially open doors for demons to manifest. But there were others, places where emotions ran too high, where thousands of people experienced the same feeling simultaneously. Battlefields, hive cities, anywhere suffering and despair were concentrated. This entire city is a weak point, Sukuna realized, extending his senses outward. Billions of humans packed together in a metal honeycomb, living in squalor, dying in droves. Their collective misery is creating a constant pressure on the barrier between reality and the warp. He could taste it in the air, the potential for demonic manifestation, the thin spots where reality was weakest. If he wanted to, he could probably tear a hole in the universe right now, create a portal to the warp and let demons pour through. But why would he want that? Demons were tools at best. Interesting specimens to study, certainly, but ultimately limited by their nature. They were manifestations of emotion. They couldn't grow beyond what their creators felt, couldn't evolve past the fundamental concepts that birthed them. Sukuna was different. He had started as a human, had elevated himself through study and violence and consumption into something transcendent. He wasn't limited by the emotions of others. He was his own being, separate, independent, capable of growth. No, he thought, his grin returning. I don't need demons. I need knowledge, understanding. I need to learn everything this universe has to offer, and then I need to surpass it. He had time. He had power. And now he had a goal. First, I'll learn everything about the warp, how it functions, how it's accessed, how it's controlled. I'll consume every psyker, every sorcerer, every demon I encounter, and I'll take their knowledge for my own. Then I'll experiment. I'll find ways to blend my cursed energy with warp power. I'll create new techniques, new abilities, things this universe has never seen. And finally, when I'm ready, I'll enter the warp itself. I'll carve out my own domain in the Imperium. I'll face these chaos gods and show them what a real god looks like. I'll remake this universe in my image. The thought made him laugh again, that terrible sound that sent nearby humans fleeing in terror. Above him, somewhere in the upper levels of the hive, alarms were beginning to sound. The Adeptus Arbites had been alerted to his presence. The local PDF was mobilizing. Perhaps even the Space Marines would get involved if they had a chapter nearby. Let them come. Sukuna had fought armies before. He had faced the strongest sorcerers of his generation and laughed at their weakness. He had been sealed for 1,000 years and emerged stronger than ever. These humans, with their crude weapons and their limited understanding of the power they were playing with, weren't a threat. They were material. He continued walking, his 4 arms swinging casually at his sides, his face split in a grin that showed far too many teeth. Behind him, reality shuddered, still recovering from his domain expansion. The warp, which had touched that stabilized space for those brief seconds, was already trying to understand what it had encountered. Demons were whispering to each other in the Imperium, spreading word of something new, something different, something that tasted like order in a realm of chaos. In his palace of brass and blood, Khorne's attention shifted minnow. Telly, drawn to reports of something that killed without worship, that shed blood without offering it to any god. In his garden of plague and despair, Nurgle chuckled, sensing a new form of suffering entering his universe. The suffering of souls that couldn't be corrupted, couldn't be twisted, could only be destroyed. In his crystalline maze of scheming and change, Tzine paused in his eternal plotting, examining timelines that suddenly branched in ways his prescience couldn't predict. In her palace of excess and sensation, Slaanesh stirred, intrigued by the possibility of a being that felt such pure joy in destruction, such aesthetic appreciation for violence. But Sukuna knew none of this yet. He was still learning, still gathering information, still preparing himself for the cosmic game he had decided to play. He was patient. He had eternity after all. Location: Inquisitorial Fortress, the bastion of eternal vigilance, Metallus-VII. 12 hours after Sukuna's arrival. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex had not slept in 43 hours, and she had no intention of sleeping anytime soon. The picked feed playing on the holoth before her showed carnage on a scale that would have made most Imperial citizens weep. Bodies cut with surgical precision, entire squads of guardsmen bisected simultaneously, an Ork mob 300 strong reduced to component parts in seconds. And at the center of it all, a four-armed figure that moved with the casual grace of a predator who had never known fear. "Play it again," she ordered, her voice hoarse from too much stim and not enough water. Her interrogator, a thin man named Malthius, no relation to the corrupted sorcerer whose body had been found hours ago, manipulated the controls. The picked feed rewound and played again. Sukuna stepping onto the battlefield, the invisible attack that bisected hundreds, the casual way he had torn through the Ork charge. Cassandra had served the Emperor for 30 years. She had fought chaos cults on 17 worlds. She had personally executed 3 planetary governors for heresy. She had stared into the eyes of a demon prince and lived to tell about it. This was worse. Analysis. She barked to the tech priest hovering near the cogitator banks. Magos Vox. He had been born Julius Vox, but decades of augmentation had left little human remaining. Processed the data through his neural implants before responding, his voice carrying the typical binary cant of his order. Subject displays capabilities inconsistent with known xenoforms. Attacks show characteristics of psychic manifestation but lack warp signatures. Tactical analysis suggests threat level, Apocalypse Omega. Recommendation: immediate exterminatus of Metallus-VII. No, Cassandra said flatly. Probability of successful containment, 0.03%. Probability of spread to additional systems if not contained, 97.8%. The risk is noted and dismissed, Cassandra interrupted. Metallus-VII has a population of 43 billion souls. I will not condemn them to death without trying every other option first. She turned to the other occupant of the command center, Brother Captain Thaddeus of the Grey Knights, 8th Brotherhood, who stood in his silver armor like a statue carved from moonlight and faith. He had been the closest Grey Knight presence when the emergency Vox had gone out, and he had arrived via Thunderhawk within 6 hours of the first reports. "Brother Captain," Cassandra said, "your assessment." Thaddeus was silent for a long moment, his psychic senses extended to their maximum range, trying to feel what everyone in this room could see on the picked feed. Finally, he spoke, his voice resonant with psychic overtones. "This is not chaos." The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Explain," Cassandra demanded. "Chaos corrupts," Thaddeus said, his eyes never leaving the holoth. "It twists. It marks everything it touches with the signature of the warp. We knights are trained to sense that corruption, to feel it in our souls like a wound. This, he gestured at the image of Sukuna frozen mid-stride, this is something else. Its presence doesn't corrupt, it doesn't mark, it simply destroys. Then what is it? Interrogator Malthus asked, speaking for the first time. Unknown, Thaddeus admitted, and the words seemed to pain him. Grey Knights were the Emperor's weapon against the demonic. They fought entities that mortals couldn't comprehend, wielded powers that would shatter unaugmented minds. They were trained to understand chaos in all its forms. But this wasn't chaos. We have one survivor who had direct psychic contact, Cassandra said, pulling up another file. Psyker 3rd Class Jeremiah Mendel. He's currently in the Medici facility, recovering from severe neural trauma. His mind was touched by this entity. I need to speak with him, Thaddeus S. Aid immediately. That's inadvisable, his condition. Inquisitor Vex, the Grey Knight interrupted gently. I have faced things that would turn your soul inside out. I have spoken with demons of such power that their true names would cause your head to explode. If this psyker has information about what we're facing, then I need it, regardless of his condition. Cassandra considered, then nodded. Very well, but I'm coming with you. 20 minutes later, they stood in the Medici ward, looking down at Jeremiah Mendel. The psyker looked like he had aged 20 years in 12 hours. His hair had gone white. His hands trembled constantly. When he saw them enter, he tried to sit up, failed, and settled for a weak salute. Inquisitor, Lord Knight. At ease, Mendel, Cassandra said, pulling up a chair. Thaddeus remained standing, his psychic senses gently probing the psyker's mind, feeling the damage that had been done. Emperor's mercy, he thought. It's like someone took a blade and carved through his mental defenses. Precise, controlled, not the chaotic violation of a demon but the surgical strike of an expert. Tell us what happened, Cassandra said. Everything. Start from when you first sensed the anomaly. Jeremiah did. His voice was weak, breaking occasionally, but he described it all. The tear in reality that wasn't the warp, the presence that felt like cursed energy, a term he still couldn't explain, the casual way his defenses had been destroyed, the examination of his soul. It was looking for information, Jeremiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. It went through my memories like someone flipping through a book. Everything I knew about the warp, about psychers, about demons. It just took it, and then it left, like I wasn't worth bothering with. Did it speak to you? Thaddeus asked, his voice gentle despite his urgency. Not in words, but I felt. Amusement, curiosity, it found us interesting, like we were specimens to study. Jeremiah's hands clenched into fists. And underneath all that, hunger. This thing is so hungry, Lord Knight. Not for blood or worship or anything I could understand. It's hungry for everything. Knowledge, power. It wants to consume everything it encounters and make it part of itself. Thaddeus exchanged a glance with Cassandra. That matched the profile they were building from the evidence. One more question, the Grey Knight said. When it touched your mind, when it examined your memories, did you sense anything about its origins, where it came from? Jeremiah shook his head. No, but I felt displacement, like it didn't belong here, like reality itself was still adjusting to its presence. It's not from the warp, Lord Knight. It's not from our universe at all. The room fell silent. Extra-dimensional contamination, Magos Vox said via Vox feed, having listened to the entire conversation remotely. Probability of additional manifestations, unknown. Recommendation stands, exterminatus. Cassandra ignored him. Brother Captain, can you kill it? Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. As a Grey Knight, his entire existence was dedicated to the proposition that anything could be killed if you applied enough sanctified force and holy conviction. He had killed demon princes. He had banished greater demons. He had closed warp rifts that threatened to consume entire planets. But he was also honest. I don't know, he admitted. Psyker Mendel is correct. This entity is not warp-born. Our weapons, our techniques, our very existence as Grey Knights is predicated on fighting chaos. Against something that isn't chaos, that doesn't corrupt, that operates on principles we don't understand. He trailed off. You're saying we're defenseless, Cassandra said flatly. I'm saying we're unprepared, Thaddeus corrected. There's a difference. We need more information. We need to understand what this thing is, how it operates, what its weaknesses might be. Until then, he looked back at the picked feed image of Sukuna, frozen in that moment of casual violence. Until then, we avoid direct confrontation if possible. That's not an option, Cassandra said. This thing is currently heading toward the upper hive. There are 30 billion people in those levels. If it reaches them, then 30 billion people die, Thaddeus said bluntly. Inquisitor, I understand your desire to save them, but we're dealing with something that casually destroyed a regiment and an Ork Waaagh simultaneously. Sending more guardsmen against it won't save anyone. It will just add to the body count. Cassandra wanted to argue. Every fiber of her being, every oath she had sworn, demanded that she protect the citizens of the Imperium. But she was also practical. She had seen the picked feeds. She had heard Mendel's testimony. Thaddeus was right. Then what do you suggest? She asked. D quietly. The Grey Knight was silent for a moment, thinking. When he spoke, his voice was grim. We evacuate what we can. We establish a cordon around its current position. Not to contain it, we can't, but to track its movements. We observe, we learn, and we send for every asset the Imperium can spare. If this thing is what I think it is, we're going to need an army. Jakob had joined the Astra Militarum because he wanted to see the galaxy. His family had been hive workers for 17 generations, living in the same hab block, working in the same manufactorum, dying of the same lung diseases. When the recruitment officers had come through, promising glory and adventure, and the chance to serve the Emperor beyond the confines of Metallus-VII, he had signed up immediately. Now, crouched behind a barricade made of scrap metal and sandbags, watching that thing walking through the streets 3 levels below, Jakob regretted every decision he had ever made. The squad around him was silent. Sergeant Rentz, normally loud and profane, hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. Private Yolanda, who usually never shut up, was gripping her lasgun so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Corporal Mikko, their squad's grizzled veteran with 3 decades of service, was openly weeping. They had been told to establish an observation post, to track the entity's movements, to report back to command and not engage under any circumstances. That last part was easy. Nobody in their right mind wanted to engage with that thing. Jakob watched through his magnoculars as Sukuna moved through the lower hive. The King of Curses wasn't running, wasn't even walking quickly. He strolled like a noble out for an evening walk, 4 arms swinging casually, that terrible grin never leaving his face. And everything in his path died. Sometimes he used those invisible attacks. Jakob had seen them on the picked feeds before being deployed, seen how they could bisect hundreds simultaneously. But sometimes he got creative. Sometimes he would point at a group of fleeing civilians and they would simply stop. Their bodies would lock in place, and then they would start tearing themselves apart, arms ripping at their own flesh, heads twisting at angles that broke necks. Why? Yolanda whispered, her voice cracking. Why is it doing this? What does it want? I don't think it wants anything, Sergeant Rentz said quietly. I think it's just playing. That was the worst part. The entity, Command was calling it Subject Omega in official reports, wasn't rampaging. It wasn't consumed by rage or corrupted by chaos. It was methodical, almost curious, experimenting with different ways to kill. Jakob had seen it stop once to examine a corpse it had created, had watched as those 4 red eyes studied the pattern of blood spray, as if appreciating the artistry of the destruction. It was a monster, yes, but it was an intelligent monster, a curious monster. And that somehow made it so much worse. Movement, Corporal Mikkel said suddenly, his voice thick with tears but steady with training. 270 degrees, civilian vehicle approaching the entity. Jakob swung his magnoculars around. Sure enough, a small cargo truck was careening down the street, moving far too fast for safety. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. Someone was trying to ram the entity. Thrown, Sergeant Rentz breathed. Who's the idiot? They got their answer a moment later when the truck's driver became visible. A woman, middle-aged, her face locked in an expression of pure rage and grief. Jakob could see tears streaming down her face even from 300 meters away. The truck hit Sukuna doing at least 80 kilometers per hour. Or rather, it tried to hit Sukuna. The King of Curses didn't dodge, didn't even move. He simply raised one hand almost lazily and the truck stopped, not crashed, not exploded, just stopped as if it had hit an invisible wall. The front crumpled, the engine block compressed, but it went from full speed to zero in an instant. The woman flew through the windscreen, no seat restraints, apparently, and would have sailed past Sukuna if he hadn't caught her by the throat with one hand. Jakob couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see Sukuna's mouth moving, could see the woman struggling, screaming something, her fists beating uselessly against his arm. Then Sukuna did something that made Jakob's stomach turn. He set her down, gently, carefully, and then he walked away. The woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing, still screaming. Sukuna didn't look back. Did he spare her? Yolanda asked, her voice filled with confused hope. No, Corporal Mikkel said flatly. He just decided she wasn't worth killing. That's worse. He was right. Jakob watched the woman through his magnoculars, saw her realize that she had been dismissed, found wanting, not even worth the effort of ending her life. She screamed until her throat gave out. Then she just knelt there in the street, broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. Report to command, Sergeant Rentz said, his voice dead. Subject Omega continues on heading 095. Estimated civilian casualties in the last hour, 4,000 and rising. No sign of slowing, no sign of anything. The Vox operator acknowledged and repeated the information back. 4,000 dead in an hour, and this thing had only been in the hive for 12 hours, at this rate. Jakob didn't want to do the math. Orders? Corporal Mikkel asked. Continue observation, came command's response. Do not engage. Reinforcements are being mobilized. Reinforcements. As if that would help. As if anything would help against a being that had walked through a regiment and an Ork Waaagh, like they weren't even there. Jakob settled in behind the barricade, his magnoculars trained on Subject Omega's back, and wondered if he would live to see tomorrow. Behind him, Private Yolanda began praying. The Emperor's prayer, words that had been spoken by trillions of humans across thousands of years. Jakob didn't join in. He had the terrible feeling that the Emperor, wherever he was, couldn't help them with this. Nothing could. The Grey Knight stood alone in his meditation chamber, surrounded by wards that had been carved into the walls by Titan's greatest artificers. Each ward was a masterwork of psychic engineering, designed to block demonic influence, to shield the mind from warp predation, to create a bubble of perfect clarity in which a Grey Knight could commune with his soul. They were pointless here. Thaddeus had been trying to meditate for the last 2 hours, attempting to use his psychic abilities to understand what they were facing. Grey Knights were more than just warriors. They were psychic prodigies, trained to perceive the warp in ways that would drive lesser psychers mad. Their minds were weapons as potent as their nemesis Force weapons. But every time Thaddeus extended his psychic senses toward Subject Omega, he encountered nothing. Not a void, not an anti-psychic field, just absence. It was like trying to look at something that existed in a spectrum his eyes couldn't see, trying to hear a sound at a frequency beyond his range. The entity registered to his normal senses just fine. He could see it on the picked feeds, could track its movements through the hive. But psychically, it was a blank spot, an absence where something should be. It doesn't exist in the warp, he realized. Or rather, it exists adjacent to the warp, parallel to it. Its presence doesn't leave an imprint on the Imperium because it's fundamentally separate from the Imperium. That should have been impossible. Everything with a soul left an imprint in the warp. Even blanks, those rare beings born without psychic presence, registered as voids, as missing spaces that could be detected through their very absence. This was different. This was like looking at a different color, something his psychic senses weren't designed to process. Lord Emperor, Thaddeus prayed, not to petition for aid but to order his thoughts. Guide your servant in understanding this threat. Show me how to fight what I cannot perceive. No answer came. Thaddeus hadn't expected one. The Emperor, locked in his eternal struggle on the Golden Throne, rarely answered prayers directly. But the Grey Knights carried a fragment of his power in their souls, and sometimes that was enough. Thaddeus opened his eyes and looked at the Nemesis Force sword mounted on the wall of his chamber. The weapon was a masterwork, forged on Titan from blessed silver and psychoreactive materials, inscribed with prayers that could banish even greater demons back to the warp. Would it work on something that wasn't from the warp? Only one way to find out, he thought grimly. He had told Inquisitor Vex they needed to avoid direct confrontation, and that was still true. Sending guardsmen against this entity was suicide. Even deploying space marines would be questionable. They were warriors without peer, but they were still bound by the normal rules of combat. But Grey Knights were different. They existed to fight the impossible. They wielded powers that made reality flexible. And if Thaddeus could understand this entity's nature, could find the frequency on which it operated, maybe he could kill it. Or maybe you'll just die, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered. Maybe you'll charge in with all your psychic might and sacred war gear, and it'll cut you down as easily as it did those guardsmen. Thaddeus acknowledged the possibility and dismissed it. Fear of death was a luxury Grey Knights couldn't afford. They fought demons that fed on fear. If they allowed themselves to be paralyzed by survival instinct, they would have been consumed long ago. He stood reaching for his armor. It was time to prepare. If he was going to face this entity, he would do it properly. Fully armored, fully armed, fully prepared to die in the Emperor's service. But not before I hurt you, he thought, staring at the picked feed image of Sukuna that had been transmitted to his chamber's cogitator. Not before I show you that humanity isn't defenseless, that we have claws of our own. Outside his chamber, the bastion of eternal vigilance hummed with activity. Inquisitor Vex was coordinating evacuations, trying to save what civilians she could. The Mechanicus were analyzing every scrap of data about the entity. The Astra Militarum were establishing observation posts, and prayer hoping that reinforcements would arrive before the entire hive was depopulated. And somewhere in the upper hive, Subject Omega, Sukuna, if that name from ancient texts meant anything, continued his leisurely stroll through humanity's territory, leaving a trail of corpses that already numbered in the tens of thousands. Soon, Thaddeus promised silently, soon I'll face you, and we'll see if you can die like everything else in this universe. He began the ritual of donning his armor, each piece a prayer, each seal a ward. It would take hours to properly prepare. He had time. The entity wasn't going anywhere. And when Thaddeus was ready, when he had called upon every scrap of power and faith and skill at his disposal, they would meet. The thought should have filled him with righteous determination. Instead, for the first time in his century of service, Brother Captain Thaddeus of the Grey Knights felt something uncomfortably close to fear. In the Underhive, Sector 7-Phi, Metallus-VII, 20 hours after Sukuna's arrival. The Underhive stank. Not the clean, sterile stench of promethium or the metallic tang of recycled air that characterized the upper levels. This was the smell of organic decay, of human waste and rotting corpses and chemical runoff that had been accumulating for centuries. It was the smell of humanity at its lowest, pressed beneath the weight of civilization, surviving in darkness and filth. Sukuna inhaled deeply and smiled. This is where they hide their failures, he thought, walking through tunnels that hadn't seen maintenance in generations. The outcasts, the mutants, the broken and the damned. How efficient. He had descended through the hive over the last 8 hours, moving gradually downward through the levels of human habitation. Each level had been more decrepit than the last, more dangerous, more lawless. The upper hive's gleaming spires had given way to the mid-hive's industrial squalor, which had in turn given way to the lower hive's desperate poverty. And now the underhive, where civilization ended and something more primal began. He could feel the warp more strongly here, the suffering of the underhive's inhabitants, their desperation and rage and hopelessness, created a kind of psychic smog that made the barrier between reality and the Imperium thinner. This was fertile ground for chaos to take root. And indeed, Sukuna could sense something ahead, a concentration of warp energy, centered in what appeared to be an abandoned hab complex. Let's see what I find, he thought, and walked through the rusted doorway. The chamber beyond had once been a habitation unit for perhaps 24 families. Now it was a temple. Corpses hung from the ceiling, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The walls were painted with symbols that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally. At the center of the room, arranged in a perfect circle, were 13 figures in ragged robes, chanting in a language that made the air itself curdle. Cultists, worshippers of chaos, and at the center of their circle, feeding on their devotion and their sacrifice, something was forming. A bloodlitter of corn materialized inch by inch, pulled from the warp by the cultists' ritual. It was a creature of nightmare-made flesh, crimson skin stretched over impossible musculature, a fanged maw that dripped acidic saliva, eyes that burned with eternal rage. In its clawed hands, a blade forged from its own fury, sharp enough to cut through ceramic. It saw Sukuna and roared. The sound was beyond physical. It was anger given voice, 8,000 years of endless war compressed into a single note of pure rage. The cultists collapsed, bleeding from their ears. The walls cracked. Even reality itself seemed to flinch. Sukuna's grin widened. "Now that's more like it," he said. The bloodlitter charged. It moved with supernatural speed, crossing the 20 meters between them in less than a second, its blade already swinging in an arc designed to bisect Sukuna from shoulder to hip. Sukuna caught the blade between 2 fingers and stopped it cold. The demon's eyes, insofar as burning orbs of rage could be called eyes, widened inso. Mething that might have been confusion. Its blade had tasted the blood of space marines. It had carved through land raiders. It had been forged in the eternal warfare of the blood god's domain. And this creature had stopped it with 2 fingers. "Disappointing," Sukuna said, examining the blade with interest. "The metal is interesting, though. Not quite physical, not quite energy. A crystallization of emotion into a weapon form." He looked at the bloodlitter. "Tell me, does your god forge these personally, or are they manifestations of your own rage?" The bloodlitter tried to pull its blade free, failed. Sukuna's grip was absolute. "Not very talkative, are you?" Sukuna mused. "Well, let's see what you're made of." He pulled. Not physically. He reached out with his cursed energy and grabbed the demon's essence, the fundamental structure that made it what it was, and yanked it toward him like a fisherman reeling in a catch. The bloodlitter screamed, not in rage this time, in pain. Demons weren't supposed to feel pain. They were manifestations of emotion, incapable of experiencing anything they didn't embody. A bloodletter knew rage and battle joy and the satisfaction of killing. It didn't know agony. Until now. Sukuna pulled the demon closer, examining it with his cursed energy, the way a scientist might examine a specimen under a microscope. He could feel its structure, its nature, the way it was put together. Fascinating, he thought. It's not truly alive. It's more like a program. A complex pattern of warp energy shaped by belief and emotion into a semi-stable form. The blade isn't separate from the demon. It's part of the demon's structure, an extension of its purpose. The bloodletter managed to wrench its weapon free. It stumbled backward, its form flickering, unstable. Demons were supposed to be fearless. Fear was an emotion for mortals. But this thing had just experienced something it had no context for, and its essential nature was being rewritten by confusion. Blood for the blood god, it roared, reasserting its purpose, and charged again. This time Sukuna didn't block. He simply stood there and activated a fragment of his domain. The air around him crystallized, not into ice, into something more fundamental, order. The chaotic warp energy that composed the bloodletter's form encountered Sukuna's cursed energy and began to stabilize, to freeze, to lock into a fixed pattern. The demon's charge slowed, then stopped. It stood frozen mid-stride, its blade raised, its mouth open in an eternal roar. "Perfect," Sukuna said, walking around the immobilized demon. "Now I can study you properly." He reached out and touched the bloodletter's chest. What followed was less like research and more like vivisection. Sukuna tore the demon apart, not physically but structurally. He peeled away layers of warp energy, examined how they interconnected, traced the patterns of belief and rage that gave the creature form. The bloodletter couldn't scream. It was frozen, locked in that moment. But if it could have, it would have screamed for eternity. So this is how demons work, Sukuna thought, his analytical mind cataloging everything he learned. They're stable patterns in the warp, maintained by the emotions of mortals and the will of their patron gods. The bloodletter exists because trillions of beings across the galaxy feel rage, and that rage is collected and shaped by the entity called Khorne into these forms. Which means they're not truly alive. They're more like echoes, reflections of mortal emotion given the illusion of independent existence. He pulled deeper, tearing through the demon's essence like tissue paper, until he reached something fundamental, a core of pure rage, undiluted and eternal, connected by a thread of warp energy back to its source. There, Sukuna thought, that's the link to their god, that's what sustains them. He grabbed the thread and pulled. The bloodletter exploded. Not in gore, it was made of warp energy, not flesh, but in a burst of crimson light that filled the chamber. The link to Khorne was severed, and without that connection, the demon's form couldn't sustain itself. It came apart like a sandcastle hit by a wave, its component emotions scattering back into the immaterium. But Sukuna held onto something, a fragment of that core rage, caught and contained within a shell of his cursed energy. He examined it with fascination. The rage was pure, undiluted by thought or reason. It wanted nothing except violence. It desired nothing except blood. It was, in its own way, perfect. Can I consume this? He wondered. In his original world, Sukuna had consumed cursed spirits and humans, adding their power to his own. The process was simple: overpower them, break them down, absorb them. Could he do the same with demonic essence? Only one way to find out. He brought the fragment to his second mouth, the one on his torso, and swallowed. The effect was immediate and violent. The rage tried to consume him from within, to remake him in its image. It was Khorne's essence, refined and concentrated, and it wanted to burn away everything that made Sukuna Sukuna and leave only mindless fury. Sukuna laughed and crushed it. His cursed energy wrapped around the demonic essence like chains, squeezing, compressing, forcing it into submission. The rage fought back, but it was ultimately just energy. Powerful energy, true, but without the will and intelligence to match Sukuna's own. Within seconds, the battle was over. The demonic essence was broken down, stripped of its connection to Khorne, and absorbed into Sukuna's being. He felt different, not stronger exactly, but more complete. The rage was still there, but now it was his rage, filtered through his will, controlled and directed rather than wild and chaotic. "Interesting," he said aloud, examining his hands. He could feel the warp energy now, integrated into his cursed energy. It was a tiny fraction, the essence of a single lesser demon, but it was enough to prove the concept. He could consume demons. He could take their power and make it his own. The implications made him grin wider than ever. These chaos gods think they're eternal, he thought. They think they're safe in their warp, feeding on mortal emotion forever. But what happens when someone comes along who can not only resist their corruption, but actively consume their servants? What happens when I start eating them? A sound behind him made Sukuna turn. The cultists, those who had survived the Bloodletter's manifestation and subsequent destruction, were struggling to their feet. One of them, a woman whose face was covered in ritual scars, pointed a shaking hand at Sukuna. You killed it," she whispered. "You killed the Blood God's champion." "It wasn't much of a champion," Sukuna said dismissively. "Is that really the best your gods can offer? Mindless rage and a sharp stick?" "You don't understand," another cultist said, a man missing both eyes but somehow still tracking Sukuna's movements. "You've drawn his attention. The Blood God watches now. He'll send more, stronger. You'll drown in his champions." Sukuna's grin became predatory. "Good," he said. "Send more, send stronger. I want to test myself against the best this universe has to offer." He raised one hand, preparing to kill them all with cleave, but paused. "Wait," he thought. "These cultists worship the chaos gods. They've dedicated themselves to serving these entities, which means..." He walked toward the woman with the scarred face. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't obey. Terror had locked her in place. Sukuna grabbed her head with one hand and peered into her soul. What he found there was enlightening. The woman's soul was marked, branded really with the symbol of Khorne. The mark ran deep, fundamentally altering her spiritual structure. But unlike the corrupted sorcerer Malthius, whose soul had been twisted by Tzeentch's influence, this was simpler. This was dedication, faith. She had given herself to Khorne willingly, and in return she received very little, actually. They give everything and receive almost nothing, Sukuna realized. The chaos gods take their worship, their faith, their very souls, and return only the barest trickle of power. It's exploitation on a cosmic scale. He could respect that, actually. It was efficient. "Tell me," Sukuna said, still holding the woman's head, "your Blood God. Where is he? How do I find him?" The woman's eyes, what remained of her sanity visible in them, widened. You want to seek out the Blood God. You want to enter his realm." "Eventually," Sukuna said. "But first, I want to kill more of his servants. I want to understand how they work. I want to learn everything about the warp before I claim it as mine." The woman laughed. It was a broken, insane sound. "You can't claim the warp," she said. "You can't own chaos. You can't control gods. You're strong, stranger, I'll grant you that. You killed a bloodletter with your bare hands, but you're still mortal. You're still limited. The Blood God is eternal. Khorne existed before your species crawled from the mud, and he'll exist long after your bones are dust." "Is that so?" Sukuna asked mildly. Then he showed her his domain. It expanded for just a moment, a brief flash of absolute power that overwrote reality within its bounds. The woman's soul, marked by Khorne, froze. The demonic brand that had claimed her for the Blood God stuttered, unable to function in a space where Sukuna's will was absolute. And in that moment, the connection broke. The woman screamed. It was a sound of pure loss, of emptiness, of something fundamental being ripped away. For years, perhaps decades, she had felt Khorne's presence in her soul. His rage had been her rage. His strength had flowed through her veins. And now it was gone. Sukuna released his domain and the woman collapsed, sobbing. The Khorne mark was still there, carved too deeply to remove without destroying her soul entirely, but the connection was severed. She was no longer part of the blood god's grand game. She was just a broken human with scars and nothing to show for them. "Fascinating," Sukuna murmured. "My domain can sever the link between mortal and god, temporarily at least, which means with enough power, enough understanding. He could sever it permanently. He could free the Chaos God's worshippers from their influence. Not out of mercy. Sukuna didn't do mercy, but because it would weaken the gods themselves. After all, gods needed worship. They needed the emotional energy of mortals to sustain themselves, if Sukuna could cut off their food supply. One step at a time, he reminded himself. First learn, then grow stronger, then claim what I want. He turned to leave the chamber, stepping over cultists who had lost their minds trying to process what they had just witnessed. Behind him, in the chamber's center where the bloodletter had been destroyed, a small mark appeared. It glowed briefly with crimson light before fading. Somewhere in the Imperium, in his brass fortress where skulls were piled higher than mountains, Khorne the blood god opened his eyes. Something had killed one of his demons. That happened constantly. Demons were destroyed and reformed endlessly in the eternal warfare of the warp. But something had consumed one of his demons. That was new. The blood god's interest was piqued. He dispatched more bloodletters, stronger ones, to the world called Metallus-VII. He wanted to see what had dared to eat his servants. And then he wanted its skull for his throne. Sukuna's private thoughts savor the chaos unfolding around him. So that's a demon, Sukuna thought as he walked through the underhive, his hands stained with warp energy residue that glowed faintly in the darkness. Interesting, but ultimately limited. They're powerful, yes, but they're slaves to their nature. A bloodletter can only know rage. It can't grow, can't adapt, can't learn. I can do all of those things. He had absorbed the demon's essence, and now he could feel the difference. His cursed energy had changed, subtly but noticeably. There was a new edge to it, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. The rage he had consumed was his to command, to weaponize, to shape as he saw fit. If one demon gave me this much, he thought, what would 100 give me? 1,000? What would happen if I consumed a greater demon, or one of these chaos gods themselves? The possibilities were intoxicating. In his original world, Sukuna had reached the peak of what was possible. He had consumed so many cursed spirits, so many humans, that he had become the undisputed king of curses. There was nothing left to challenge him except boredom. But here there were beings that called themselves gods, entities that had existed for millions of years, demons that numbered in the quintillions. Here there was room to grow. The warp is an ocean of power, he thought, and I'm going to drink it dry. He emerged from the underhive into what appeared to be an abandoned industrial sector. Massive machinery loomed in the darkness, rusted and silent, relics of the hive's more productive past. It was quiet here. No humans, no demons, just the sound of dripping water and distant metal groaning. Sukuna sat down on a piece of fallen machinery and closed his eyes, turning his attention inward. The demonic essence he had consumed was still there, integrated but distinct. He could feel its nature, pure rage, distilled and concentrated. In its raw form, it would have consumed him, remade him into just another Khorne berserker. But he had broken it down, stripped away its connection to the blood god, and made it his own. Can I do more? He wondered. He He reached out with his cursed energy toward the warp. Not trying to enter it, he wasn't ready for that yet, but just touching it, feeling its currents. The Imperium responded immediately. It was like dipping his hand into boiling water. The warp was hot and cold simultaneously, pressure and void, sanity and madness. It was everything and nothing all at once. And it was aware. Sukuna felt consciousnesses in there, vast beyond measure, turning their attention toward the anomaly that had just touched their realm. They examined him with interest that ranged from curiosity to hunger to rage. The Chaos Gods, sensing something new. "Hello," Sukuna thought, projecting the concept toward them. "I'm going to kill you all." The warp's response was immediate and violent. A surge of energy tried to force its way through the connection, to mark him, to corrupt him, to claim him as the Chaos Gods claimed all who touched the Imperium. Sukuna's curse. D-energy met it like a wall. The warp energy crashed against his will and broke. It couldn't touch him, couldn't corrupt him. He was fundamentally different from anything the Chaos Gods had encountered, not of the warp, not vulnerable to its influence. Interesting, Sukuna thought. They can't corrupt me, which means I'm immune to their primary weapon. He pulled his consciousness back from the warp, breaking the connection. The experience had been enlightening. He now understood, in a way he hadn't before, that the Chaos Gods' power came from belief and emotion. They shaped the warp, but they were also shaped by it. They were powerful, but they were also limited by their nature. Khorne could only be rage. Nurgle could only be despair. Tzeentch could only be ambition. Slaanesh could only be excess. They couldn't be anything else. They were defined by their domains, prisoners of the very concepts that gave them power. Sukuna had no such limitations. He could be anything, do anything, become anything. That's my advantage, he realized. They're strong, but they're predictable. I'm weaker for now, but I can adapt, grow, change. And eventually, I'll surpass them. A sound caught his attention. Footsteps, dozens of them, approaching from multiple directions. Heavy boots on metal, the distinctive tromp of military movement. Sukuna opened his eyes and grinned. It seems the humans have found me again, he thought. How persistent of them. He stood, stretching his forearms, as approximately 200 Astra Militarum soldiers surrounded his position. They carried heavier weapons this time. Autocannons, missile launchers, plasma guns. Someone had learned from the last encounter. An officer, identified by the markings on her armor, stepped forward. She was young, her face hard with determination that barely concealed her terror. "By order of Inquisitor Cassandra Vex," she shouted, her voice only shaking slightly, "you are commanded to surrender yourself for interrogation and classification." Sukuna laughed. "No." The officer's jaw clenched. She raised her hand, preparing to give the order to fire. Then the screaming started. From the shadows of the industrial sector, from the darkness between machines, from the warp tiers that suddenly ripped open in reality, they came. Bloodletters, dozens of them, more than should have been able to manifest in real space at once. Khorne had sent his response. The guardsmen whirled, suddenly finding themselves fighting on two fronts. The demons crashed into their lines with unholy fury, hell blades carving through armor and flesh with equal ease. And Sukuna stood in the center of it all, watching with interest as humans and demons killed each other. Perfect, he thought. Let them weaken each other. Then I'll take what I want from the survivors. This was going to be a very educational evening. The slaughter was exquisite. Sukuna watched as the bloodletters tore through the guardsmen lines, their hell blades opening arteries and severing limbs with contemptuous ease. The soldiers fought back valiantly, credit where it was due, but they were outmatched. Lasguns that could punch through light armor merely scorched demonic flesh. Plasma weapons that could melt ceramite just made the bloodletters angrier. One demon, larger than the others, carved its way through an entire squad in seconds. Its blade moved faster than human eyes could track, and where it passed, bodies fell in pieces. The demon roared its satisfaction, bellowing what was presumably praise to Khorne. Then Sukuna flicked his finger. Dismantle. The demon froze mid-roar. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then it fell apart. Not randomly, not explosively. It simply separated along every major structural line simultaneously. Arms from torso, legs from hips, head from neck. Each piece distinct, each cut perfect. The component parts hit the ground with wet sounds, and the demonic essence that held the bloodletter together leaked out like steam, returning to the warp. The other demons stopped. Their rage-filled minds couldn't comprehend what had just happened, but instinct, ancient survival programming that predated their individual manifestations, made them turn towards Sukuna. The surviving guardsmen stopped too, recognizing that they were now spectators to something far beyond their ability to intervene in. "Come on then," Sukuna said, spreading his forearms wide in invitation. "Let's see if you're more interesting than your brother." 23 bloodletters charged simultaneously. Sukuna's grin widened to impossible proportions. Cleave. The invisible blade swept out in a horizontal arc. 14 demons bisected at the waist, their lower halves still running forward while their upper halves toppled backward. The cuts were so clean that it took a moment for the demonic essence to realize it had been separated and begin leaking away. He remaining 9 scattered, showing more tactical intelligence than bloodletters were supposed to possess. They circled Sukuna, looking for openings, trying to coordinate their attack. Their learning, Sukuna realized with interest. Or rather, the blood god is learning through them, adjusting their behavior based on what happened to the others. Good, I prefer prey that fights back. He reached out with his cursed energy, not to attack but to examine. The demons were connected, not to each other directly, but to their source. He could sense the threads of warp energy that linked each bloodletter back to Khorne's domain, sustaining them, guiding them. Those threads are the key, Sukuna thought. Cut them and the demons fall apart. But if I could grab them, trace them back to their source. One of the bloodletters lunged, its hellblade aimed at Sukuna's neck. He caught the blade again, this time not between his fingers but with his cursed energy, creating a shell of pure power around the weapon that stopped it cold. Then he grabbed the thread. The bloodletter screamed, not in rage, in terror. Demons weren't supposed to feel terror. Terror was an emotion for mortals, for beings that could die. But as Sukuna's cursed energy wrapped around the connection to Khorne, as he began pulling on that thread like a fisherman with a line, the demon experienced something new. The fear of cessation, of true death, of not just being banished back to the warp to reform, but of being ended, consumed, erased from existence. Sukuna pulled harder. The thread resisted. Through it, he could feel Khorne's attention, the blood god's will opposing his own. The thread was more than just energy. It was belief, worship, the accumulated rage of trillions of souls across the galaxy. It was the foundation of Khorne's existence. And Sukuna was trying to steal a piece of it. The tug-of-war lasted for perhaps 3 seconds. In that time, Sukuna learned more about the Chaos Gods than he had from consuming 100 lesser demons. They're not omnipotent. Despite their power, despite their age, despite their claims to godhood, they could be resisted. The thread should have been unbreakable. It was sustained by belief that spanned the galaxy, but Sukuna's will was strong enough to contest it. They're not omniscient. Khorne knew Sukuna was pulling on the thread, but the blood god didn't know what Sukuna was, where he came from, or how to counter him. The Chaos God's knowledge was vast but limited to the warp and what touched it. They're not invulnerable. The thread could be cut. It wouldn't kill Khorne. He had trillions of these connections across the galaxy, but it could be cut. which meant the blood god for all his power could be harmed. Then Sukuna let go. Not because he couldn't maintain his grip, but because he had learned what he wanted to know. The bloodletter collapsed, its connection to Khorne strained but intact, its form flickering with instability. Sukuna stepped back and gestured magnanimously. "Go ahead," he said to the remaining demons. "Attack me. Let's make this interesting." They did. What followed was less a battle and more an exhibition. Sukuna didn't just kill the bloodletters, he experimented with them. He used cleave and dismantle in variations he had never tried before, creating cuts that spiraled, that branched, that formed complex geometric patterns. He tested how much demonic essence he could consume safely, discovering that he could absorb 3 lesser demons' worth before needing to pause and integrate the power. He practiced stabilizing warp energy with his cursed energy, creating tiny pockets where the demonic forms froze, neither banished nor sustained but locked in temporal stasis. He even tried communicating with them, sending concepts through his cursed energy. "Serve me instead. Your god is limited. I am not. I can offer you growth, evolution, purpose beyond mindless rage." The bloodletters couldn't comprehend the offer. They were too simple, too focused, too much extensions of Khorne's will to consider alternatives. But Sukuna filed the failure away as useful data. Perhaps more complex demons would be capable of being suborned. Finally, after approximately 7 minutes of experimentation, he killed the last bloodletter and turned his attention to the guardsmen. About half of them had survived, pressed against a wall of machinery, their weapons pointed in Sukuna's general direction, with hands that shook despite years of training. The young officer was still alive, her armor scored with claw marks but her body intact. She raised her bolt pistol, aiming it at Sukuna's head with grim determination. "Stay back," she said, her voice cracking only slightly. "I don't know what you are, but—" Sukuna was suddenly in front of her, moving faster than human reflexes could track. He plucked the bolt pistol from her hand as casually as taking a toy from a child. "But what?" he asked, genuinely curious. The officer stared at him, her jaw working soundlessly. Up close, Sukuna could see that she was even younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 20 standard years, barely out of training, probably promoted recently due to heavy casualties. She was terrified. He could smell it on her, taste it in the air, but she hadn't run, hadn't broken. Even now, standing within arm's reach of something that had just casually destroyed 23 demons, she held her ground. Interesting, Sukuna thought. These humans breed for courage, at least. "What's your name?" he asked. The officer blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Lieutenant Kara Thurin, 199th Metallus PDF. "Well, Lieutenant Kara Thurin," Sukuna said, handing her bolt pistol back to her, "I'm going to let you live. Do you know why?" She took the pistol with shaking hands, clearly not understanding but afraid to ask. "Because I want you to tell your superiors what you saw here today. I want them to know that their demons can't stop me, their gods can't protect them, and neither can your emperor." He leaned closer, his 4 red eyes boring into hers. "I am Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses, and I'm going to devour this universe piece by piece until there's nothing left but my domain." He straightened and turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing," he said without looking back. "Tell your Inquisitor and that Grey Knight that if they want to challenge me, I'll be in the Underhive for the next few days. I have some experiments to conduct. They're welcome to interrupt if they think they can survive." Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows between machines, leaving Lieutenant Thurin and her surviving soldiers standing in a field of bisected demons and trying to process what had just happened. Thurin stood there for a long moment, her bolt pistol hanging limp in her hand. Then she activated her Vox speed with trembling fingers. "Command," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is Lieutenant Thurin. Demon incursion has been neutralized. Subject Omega is responsible. I need to report to the Inquisitor immediately." "Acknowledged," Command replied. "Stay where you are. Valkyrie extraction is en route." Thurin cut the Vox link and looked at her surviving soldiers. They all wore the same expression: shock, horror, and a growing understanding that they were caught in something far beyond anything the Tactica Imperialis had prepared them for. "Emperor, protect us," one of them whispered. Thurin didn't respond. She was beginning to suspect that the Emperor couldn't protect them from this. Nothing could. The King's silent reflections reveal a hunger that eclipses worlds. That was productive. Sukuna walked through the Underhive's labyrinthine passages, his mind organizing and cataloging everything he had learned from the encounter. First, demon essence can be consumed and integrated. The process is difficult, requiring careful breaking down of the warp energy into a form compatible with my cursed energy, but it's possible. Each demon I consume strengthens me incrementally and expands my understanding of the warp. Second, demons are connected to their gods through threads of belief and emotion. These threads can be contested, though the resistance is significant. With enough power and understanding, I could potentially sever these connections permanently or even hijack them for my own use. Third, the Chaos Gods are aware of me now. The Bloodletter incursion was too organized, too targeted to be coincidental. Khorne, at minimum, knows I exist and is interested in testing me. That last point was both exciting and concerning. Exciting because it meant his actions were having an impact significant enough to draw divine attention. Concerning because he wasn't yet strong enough to face a Chaos God directly. Patience, he reminded himself. I have time. The Chaos Gods are eternal, which means they think in eons. They won't move against me with their full force until they understand what I am, which gives me time to become strong enough to survive their full force. He found what he was looking for, another abandoned chamber, this one part of what had once been a water reclamation facility. The space was large, roughly 50 meters across, with a ceiling high enough that his domain could expand properly without being constrained. Perfect. Sukuna sat down in the center of the chamber and crossed his legs, settling into a meditative posture. In his original world, meditation had been how he refined his cursed energy, how he integrated new techniques, how he contemplated the nature of power. It would serve the same purpose here. He closed his eyes and turned his attention inward, examining the demonic essence he had consumed. 3 bloodletters worth of pure rage, crystallized and contained within. His cursed energy. It struggled against his control, trying to break free, to remake him into a servant of Khorne. No, he thought firmly, and crushed the resistance. The essence shuddered and submitted. Sukuna began the painstaking process of integrating it properly, breaking down the raw warp energy and reassembling it in a form that complemented rather than conflicted with his cursed energy. It took hours. When he finally opened his eyes, the chamber was darker. Either time had passed or the already dim lighting had failed further. But Sukuna could see perfectly well with his enhanced senses. And he could feel the difference in himself. The demonic essence was now fully integrated. The rage was his, filtered through his will, no longer a separate entity struggling for dominance, but a tool to be wielded at his discretion. More importantly, he had gained something unexpected, a sensitivity to the warp. Before, he had been able to sense the Imperium only vaguely, like someone feeling heat from a distant fire. Now, with warp energy actually integrated into his being, he could perceive it more clearly. He could feel the currents, the eddies, the places where it pressed against reality. And he could sense the presences within it. Thousands of demons churning in the sea of chaos, larger presences that must be greater demons, and beyond them, vast and terrible, the attention of the Chaos Gods themselves. This is progress, Sukuna thought with satisfaction. I'm beginning to bridge the gap between cursed energy and warp power. Eventually, I'll be able to operate in both realms simultaneously, drawing on the strengths of each without the weaknesses. He stood, stretching his forearms, feeling the power coursing through his body. The demonic essence had strengthened him, but not dramatically. 3 lesser demons were barely a drop in the ocean compared to his existing power. But that was fine. He had eternity to gather drops until they became an ocean of their own. Now he thought, let's test my new capabilities. He extended his senses outward, using his new warp sensitivity to search for more demons. The Underhive was thick with chaos corruption, ideal hunting ground. Within moments, he found them, a cluster of presences approximately 3 kilometers away in what appeared to be an abandoned cathedral. Not just bloodletters this time. He could sense different flavors of demonic essence. Perfect, Sukuna thought, grinning. Let's see how the other chaos gods taste. He began walking, his footsteps echoing through empty passages, heading toward his next meal. Behind him, carved into the wall of the chamber where he had meditated, though no one had seen him carve it, were symbols that hurt to look at. A blending of his cursed techniques with warp energies, creating something new, something that this universe had never seen before. The symbols glowed briefly, with pink light before fading. In the warp, the chaos gods felt it, a ripple in the Imperium, a disturbance that didn't fit their understanding of reality. Khorne's interest intensified. This thing that had consumed his bloodletters and challenged his dominance was growing stronger. Good. The blood god desired worthy skulls for his throne, and this one might be worthy indeed. Tzinch's attention sharpened. His prescience had failed to predict this entity's arrival, and now it was evolving in ways that defied his sight. The architect of fate began weaving schemes within schemes, preparing contingencies for every possible outcome. Nurgle chuckled, pleased. Something new had entered the garden of existence. It would struggle, it would fight, but eventually everything succumbed to entropy. Patience was required. Decay was inevitable. And Slaanesh simply watched with growing fascination. Here was a being that felt joy in destruction, that approached violence as an art form, that was so confident in its own existence that it didn't need worship or validation. How? Delicious. But Sukuna knew none of this. He was focused on the immediate future, on the hunt, on the next step in his evolution. The King of Curses was learning to play a new game, and he had every intention of winning. The abandoned Cathedral of St. Macharius, buried deep within Underhive Sector 9 Gamma on the forsaken world of Metallus-VII. 36 hours after Sukuna's arrival. The cathedral had been beautiful once. Built during the age of apostasy, when the ecclesiarchy's power had reached its height, the structure had been a monument to faith. Vaulted ceilings 300 meters high, stained glass windows depicting the emperor's victories, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, capacity for 10,000 worshippers. Now it was a charnel house. The windows had shattered centuries ago, leaving only jagged edges that caught what little light filtered down from above. The floors were covered in filth and whirs. Things, and where the altar had once stood, where priests had delivered sermons about the emperor's glory. Now there was a warp rift. Sukuna stood at the cathedral's entrance, surveying the scene with interest. He could sense multiple demon presences, but they felt different from the bloodletters he'd encountered. More diverse, more complex. Good, he thought. Variety will make this educational. He walked forward, his footsteps echoing through the vast space. Immediately, the demons noticed him. From the left, emerging from shadows that were darker than they should have been, demonettes of Slaanesh, 6-limbed creatures that moved with hypnotic grace, their forms simultaneously beautiful and grotesque. They whispered promises of pleasure and pain in voices like honey laced with arsenic. From the right, shambling forward with inexorable inevitability, plague-bearers of Nurgle, bloated, diseased things that leaked pus and corruption with every step. They carried rusted blades and bells that tolled with the sound of entropy itself. From above, descending on wings of impossible color, horrors of Tzeentch, pink and blue, giggling and cackling, reality warping around them as they prepared sorcerous attacks. And at the center, emerging from the warp rift itself, something larger. Sukuna stopped walking and grinned. A greater demon, he realized, feeling the weight of the presence. Finally, something interesting. The being that stepped through the rift was enormous, easily 4 meters tall, its form shifting between multiple configurations as if reality couldn't quite decide what shape it should hold. One moment it appeared as a massive warrior clad in Baroque armor. The next, a serpentine scholar wreathed in flame. Then a beautiful androgyne whose very presence made the air shimmer with possibility. A greater demon of Tzeentch, a lord of change. It settled into a form that was vaguely avian, with wings that spread 12 meters across and feathers that cycled through colors that had no names. Its face was simultaneously that of a bird, a man, and something that defied categorization. Eyes, dozens of them, opened across its body, each one seeing different possible futures. When it spoke, its voice was layers upon layers, every possible inflection and tone happening simultaneously. So, you are the anomaly, the thing that should not be. Sukuna's grin widened. I get that a lot. The Lord of Change tilted its head, an eerily bird-like gesture. My master has seen your coming in the threads of fate, or rather, he has seen the hole where your coming should have been. You are a blind spot in destiny, mortal, a variable that was not accounted for. Good, Sukuna said. I'd hate to be predictable. You have killed the blood god's servants, consumed their essence. You think this makes you powerful? The demon's laughter was like breaking glass mixed with the screams of 1,000 lost souls. You are an insect playing at godhood. My master has schemed for 10 million years. He has manipulated the rise and fall of civilizations. He has woven plots that span galaxies and eons. What are you compared to that? Sukuna considered the question seriously. I'm the thing your master didn't predict, which means for all his scheming, for all his supposed mastery of fate, he missed something fundamental. He spread his forearms wide. I'm the flaw in his perfect plan, the variable that breaks his equations. The Lord of Change's eyes narrowed, all of them simultaneously. Bold words. Let us see if you can back them with deeds. It raised one clawed hand, and reality screamed. The cathedral twisted. Geometry that had been merely architecture became impossible, walls bending into angles that shouldn't exist, floors becoming ceilings, becoming walls in a recursive loop that would have driven mortal minds instantly mad. The warp flooded in, transforming the physical space into something that existed simultaneously in real space and the Imperium. The lesser demons attacked in concert. Demonettes rushed forward, moving with blurring speed, their claws capable of parting ceramite like silk. Plague-bearers advanced at their plodding pace, each step spreading disease that could corrupt even Astartes' armor. Horrors shrieked and unleashed bolts of warp fire, multicolored flames that burned soul rather than flesh. And the Lord of Change began to cast. Words of power echoed through the twisted space, each syllable a spell in its own right. Bolt after bolt of pure change energy lanced toward Sukuna, attacks that could transmute matter into something else, that could age a space marine to dust in seconds, that could rewrite the fundamental structure of reality itself. Sukuna stood in the center of it all and laughed. Domain expansion, malevolent shrine. The technique activated differently this time. Before, when Sukuna had used his domain, it had been Q. Uic, a flash of power designed to demonstrate a point. Now, with his greater understanding of this universe's nature, with the demonic essence integrated into his being, he poured more power into it. The domain expanded outward in a sphere, 50 meters in diameter, and everything within it changed. The twisted geometry of the Lord of Change's spell straightened. The warp energy flooding the space crystallized, frozen in place like insects in amber. The demonettes found themselves unable to move, their hypnotic grace replaced by total immobility. The plague-bearers' advance stopped as if they had hit an invisible wall. The horror's warp fire guttered and died, the flames unable to burn in a space where Sukuna's will was absolute. And the Lord of Change's spell simply failed. The greater demon's eyes widened in something that might have been shock. Impossible, this is. Possible, Sukuna interrupted. Very possible. You see, your warp is chaos, a motion given form, constantly shifting, impossible to predict or control. But my domain is order, structure, fixed rules, and when order meets chaos. He gestured, and the demonettes closest to him simply came apart. Not cut by any visible blade, but disassembled on a molecular level, their demonic essence scattered as his domain's inherent technique, cleave and dismantle, guaranteed to hit within its bounds, activated automatically. Order wins. The Lord of Change shrieked and exerted its will. It was a greater demon, a being of immense power, sustained by the belief and worship of billions and empowered by one of the 4 fundamental forces of the warp. It refused to be contained. The two wills clashed. For a moment the domain flickered. The Lord of Change's power was immense, backed by Tzeentch himself, by millennia of accumulated worship and fear. It pushed against Sukuna's domain, trying to shatter it, trying to reassert the chaos that was its natural state. Sukuna felt the strain. Maintaining his domain in normal reality was difficult enough. Maintaining it against the active resistance of a greater demon, while simultaneously fighting off lesser demons, was exponentially harder. Not enough, he realized. I'm not strong enough yet to maintain this indefinitely against this level of opposition. So he changed tactics. Instead of trying to maintain the full domain, he compressed it, shrunk it down from 50 meters to 20, then to 10, then to 5. But what he lost in size, he gained in intensity. The concentrated domain became denser, more absolute. Within its smaller bounds, his control was perfect, complete, unassailable. And he used that control to tear the Lord of Change apart. Not physically, not yet. First, Sukuna reached out with his cursed energy and grabbed the threads that connected the greater demon to Tzeentch. There were dozens of them. Greater demons were sustained by more than just their patron's will, but by the accumulated belief of all their worshippers, by every scheme they had ever woven, by every change they had ever catalyzed. Sukuna grabbed them all and pulled. The Lord of Change screamed. It was a sound that transcended physical noise, a psychic shriek that echoed through both real space and the warp. In his crystalline labyrinth, Tzeentch felt one of his greater servants being attacked in a way that should not have been possible. Sukuna pulled harder, dragging not just the demon but the connections themselves toward him, trying to tear them free from Tzeentch's domain. It was like trying to move a mountain. The architect of fates will oppose him, the accumulated power of billions of schemes pushing back against his cursed energy. The threads strained but held. Not yet, Sukuna thought, not strong enough yet, but soon. He released the threads. Keeping that kind of pressure up would exhaust him too quickly, and instead focused on the demon's physical form. Cleave. The invisible blade swept through the Lord of Change's body horizontally. Demonic essence leaked from the wound like luminous smoke. Dismantle. Dozens of precise cuts followed, targeting specific points in the demon's structure. Wings separated from body, arms from torso. The greater demon came apart piece by piece, its form unable to hold cohesion within Sukuna's domain where his techniques were guaranteed to hit. But greater demons were not so easily destroyed. Even as its body came apart, the Lord of Change continued casting. Words of power spilled from its beak, each one a reality-warping spell. It couldn't move. Sukuna's domain prevented that, but it could still speak, and for a Tzinkian demon, speech was weapon enough. The cathedral began to change again, this time from outside Sukuna's domain. The walls became liquid, flowing and reforming. The floor opened up into portals leading to other times, other places, other realities. More demons began manifesting pulled through from the warp by the Lord of Change's desperate casting. Clever, Sukuna admitted. If you can't break my domain directly, you attack from outside it, forcing me to either expand my domain and weaken it, or maintain my concentration and let your reinforcements build up. It was a good strategy. Against almost any opponent, it would have worked. Sukuna was not almost any opponent. He released his domain entirely. The sudden absence of that stabilizing force caused chaos, literal chaos, as the warp energy that had been held in check came flooding back. The lesser demons that had been frozen resumed their attack. The Lord of Change, its body still bisected and dismantled but held together by pure will, began to reconstitute itself. And Sukuna moved. He crossed the distance to the nearest plague bearer in a single step, moving faster than demonic reflexes could track. His hand plunged into the demon's chest, not a physical attack, but a spiritual one, his cursed energy bypassing flesh, or what passed for flesh in demonic forms, to grab the essence directly. The plague bearer didn't even have time to scream before Sukuna ripped its core out and consumed it. The demon's essence flooded into him, despair, decay, the inevitability of entropy. It was vile, diseased, fundamentally opposed to his nature. But Sukuna had consumed cursed spirits that embodied humanity's worst fears and darkest impulses. He knew how to break down poison and extract what was useful. He moved to the next demon, then the next, then the next. In 15 seconds, he consumed 7 lesser demons. The demonettes tried to stop him, their claws seeking his flesh, but his cursed energy formed a barrier that they couldn't penetrate. The horrors launched more warp fire, but Sukuna simply walked through it, his resistance to corruption preventing the flames from affecting him. And with each demon he consumed, he grew stronger. The essence integrated faster now that he had practice. The Nurgle touched despair, the Slaanesh fueled desire, the Tzinkian ambition. He took it all, broke it down, and added it to his power. The Lord of Change, now mostly reconstituted, realized what was happening. You're adapting, learning, you're using us as fuel. Finally, Sukuna said, his voice layered now with demonic harmonics from the essence he'd consumed. You understand. He turned his full attention back to the greater demon. His cursed energy had grown noticeably stronger from the consumed demons, and his understanding of the warp had deepened. He could feel the Imperium more clearly now, could sense the currents and eddies, could perceive the structure that underlay the apparent chaos. One more push, he thought. I can take this one. He activated his domain again, but this time he did something different. Instead of trying to impose order on the warp energy, he shaped it, used his newfound understanding to guide the chaos rather than suppress it, to bend the Imperium to his will rather than opposing it directly. The domain that formed was different from before. It was still his malevolent shrine, still guaranteed his techniques would hit, but now it had an additional quality. It didn't just stabilize warp energy, it consumed it. The Lord of Change felt its connection to Tzinch weaken, as the domain began draining the very power that sustained it. No, this is not, this cannot. Can, Sukuna said and advanced. The greater demon tried to flee, tried to disperse back into the warp, but Sukuna's domain held it in place. Tried to cast, but the words of power died in its throat as the warp energy needed to fuel them was drained away. Tried to fight, but its form was weakening, held together only by Tzinch's will, and even that connection was fraying. Sukuna reached the demon and placed one hand on its chest. "I'm going to consume you now," he said conversationally. "A greater demon, servant of a chaos god millennia old. I wonder what knowledge you hold, what secrets you've gathered in your existence." "You cannot consume me," the Lord of Change shrieked. "I am eternal. I am one with the great conspirator I am." "Food," Sukuna finished and pulled. The process of consuming a greater demon was different from consuming lesser demons. The essence was denser, more complex, more integrated with its patron god. Tearing it free from Tzeentch's domain was like trying to uproot an ancient tree. The demon had been connected to the architect of fate for so long that separation was agonizing for both parties. But Sukuna was relentless. He pulled and pulled, his cursed energy working like acid, dissolving the connections between demon and god. The Lord of Change came apart, not physically this time but spiritually, its essence fragmenting under the assault. And through the demon, Sukuna touched something vast. For a brief moment, less than a second, his consciousness brushed against Tzeentch himself, the architect of fate, the changer of ways, the great conspirator, a being of such complexity that mortal minds couldn't comprehend even a fraction of it, an entity that existed simultaneously in a billion places, weaving a billion plots, seeing a billion possible futures. And in that moment, Tzeentch saw him back. The two consciousnesses met, and for that instant neither could understand the other. Tzeentch saw Sukuna and saw an impossibility, a being that existed outside fate, that couldn't be predicted or controlled or even properly perceived. A blind spot in the infinite web of causality. Sukuna saw Tzeentch and saw a prisoner. For all its power, for all its schemes, the chaos god was limited by its nature. It could only be change, only be ambition, only be planning and plotting. It couldn't be anything else. It was, in its own way, as constrained as any mortal. Then the moment passed. The connection severed as Sukuna finished consuming the Lord of Change's essence, the greater demon finally torn free from its patron and absorbed. Sukuna stood alone in the cathedral, surrounded by the remains of lesser demons, and processed what he had just taken in. The greater demon's essence was overwhelming. Millennia of accumulated knowledge, thousands of spells and sorceries, the experience of countless schemes and plots. It was too much to integrate immediately. He would need days, perhaps weeks, to fully absorb everything. But even the fraction he could access immediately was significant. He could feel his connection to the warp deepen, could sense the Imperium with clarity that approached true sight, could feel the currents of fate itself, the threads of causality that Tzeentch manipulated so masterfully. And he understood, finally, how to truly enter the warp. Soon, he thought, his grin returning despite the exhaustion from the battle. Very soon, I'll be ready to step into the Imperium directly, to carve out my own domain in that ocean of chaos, to show these so-called gods what real power looks like. He turned to leave the cathedral, his footsteps echoing through the now silent space. Behind him, the warp rift pulsed once and closed, severed from this side by the consumption of its guardian. The remaining demonic essence dissipated, returning to the Imperium. And in 4 separate domains, a brass fortress of skulls, a garden of plague and despair, a crystalline maze of infinite complexity, and a palace of dark excess, 4 chaos gods turned their full attention to Metallus-VII. The anomaly was no longer merely interesting. It was a threat. Guardsman Jakob Torstein Th Ottes watched through his magnoculars as Subject Omega emerged from the abandoned cathedral, and he knew he was looking at something different. The entity moved the same way, that casual, confident stride, but there was something changed about it. The air around it seemed to shimmer, reality bending slightly in its presence. And when Jakob tried to focus his magnoculars on it directly, the image distorted, as if the lenses couldn't quite process what they were seeing. "Command," Sergeant Rent said into the Vox, his voice tight. "Subject Omega is on the move, heading northwest, toward the central underhive." "Acknowledged," came the response. "Continue observation, do not engage." As if they had a choice. Jakob had been watching Subject Omega for 12 hours now, part of a rotation of observation teams that followed the entity at a safe distance. In that time, he had watched it kill demons with casual ease, consume their essence, grow visibly stronger. And now it had killed a greater demon. The picked feeds from the cathedral's exterior had caught fragments of the battle, impossible geometry, reality-warping energies, the brief flash of Sukuna's domain expansion. The Mechanicus analysts were still trying to process the data, their cogitators overheating from attempting to calculate what should have been impossible. "How do we fight that?" Private Yolanda whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Nobody answered because nobody knew. Jakob lowered his magnoculars and allowed himself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of despair that had been building since he first saw Subject Omega on that battlefield. The Imperium was vast. It had stood for 10,000 years against every threat imaginable. Orcs, Tyranids, Necrons, chaos itself, all had broken against humanity's determination and faith. But this was something new, something that the Imperium's doctrines, its tactics, its very philosophy had no answer for. "We're going to die, aren't we?" Yolanda said, still whispering. "All of us, everyone on this world. That thing is going to kill us all." "Probably," Corporal Mikkel said bluntly, "but we die in the Emperor's service. That has to count for something." Jakob wanted to believe that, to find comfort in the idea that their deaths would have meaning, would serve some greater purpose. But watching Subject Omega walk through the underhive, growing stronger with every demon it consumed, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all just insects waiting to be crushed. And the Emperor, wherever he was, wasn't going to save them. In the depths, Metallus-VII underhive. 50 hours after Sukuna's arrival. Sukuna found a suitable location for his next experiment, a massive chamber that had once been part of the hive's geothermal core. Ancient machinery, silent for centuries, lined the walls. The floor was metal grating suspended over a chasm that dropped kilometers into darkness. The ceiling was lost in shadows. "Perfect." He sat cross-legged in the center of the chamber and turned his attention inward, examining the greater demon's essence that he had consumed. The Lord of Change had been ancient, even by demonic standards. It had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, had woven schemes that took centuries to come to fruition, had accumulated knowledge that would drive mortal minds instantly mad. All of that was now Sukuna's. So much information, he thought, sifting through the demon's memories, spells, rituals, the true nature of the warp, the weaknesses of the other chaos gods, the structure of the Imperium itself. One piece of knowledge stood out above all others: how to create a foothold in the warp. Greater demons could exist partially in real space and partially in the Imperium simultaneously. They maintained a presence in their patron's domain while manifesting physically, drawing power from the warp to sustain their forms in reality. If Sukuna could replicate that technique, I could create my own domain in the warp, he realized. Not just expand my domain expansion temporarily, but create a permanent space within the Imperium. A foothold from which I could grow, expand, eventually carve out my own territory. The idea was intoxicating. He began the process carefully. First, he extended his consciousness toward the warp, using his newfound sensitivity to touch the Imperium without fully entering it. The sensation was strange. The warp pressed against his mind like warm tar, sticky, enveloping, trying to pull him in deeper. He could hear whispers, countless voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, could see colors that didn't exist in real space, could feel emotions that had no names. Fascinating, he thought. No wonder mortal psychers go mad when they touch this without training. It's sensory overload on a cosmic scale. But Sukuna had consumed the Lord of Change. He had the demon's knowledge of how to navigate the Imperium, how to maintain his identity in a realm where individuality dissolved like sugar in water. He pushed deeper. The warp resisted at first, recognizing something foreign, something that didn't belong. But as Sukuna integrated more of the demonic essence he'd consumed, as he allowed fragments of warp energy to merge with his cursed energy, the resistance faded. The Imperium began to accept him. Not fully, not yet. He was still fundamentally different from anything the warp had encountered. Cursed energy didn't exist here, and his nature as a being from another reality made him alien in ways that even the strangest demons weren't. But he was becoming compatible. Now he thought, let's try something ambitious. He activated his domain expansion, but instead of projecting it into real space, he projected it into the warp. The effect was immediate and dramatic. In the Imperium, where chaos reigned and structure was a foreign concept, Sukuna's domain appeared like a crystal forming in supersaturated solution. It started small, barely a meter across, but it grew rapidly, expanding outward as his cursed energy imposed order on chaos. The warp screamed. Demons fled from the expanding bubble of order. The fundamental currents of the Imperium bent around it, unable to flow through a space where their chaotic nature was suppressed. Even the chaos gods noticed, 4 vast intelligences suddenly focusing on this impossible anomaly in their domain. Sukuna's domain grew to 10 meters across, 20, 50. Then it hit resistance. The chaos gods weren't passive observers anymore. They were actively opposing his attempt to claim warp space, pushing back with a fraction of their infinite power. And even a fraction of a god's power was overwhelming. Sukuna felt the pressure like a physical weight. His domain's expansion stopped, then began to compress, forced back by the combined will of Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. For the first time since arriving in this universe, he felt truly challenged. Not enough, he thought, straining to maintain the domain against divine opposition. Not strong enough yet. But he didn't need to win, not yet. He just needed to it was possible. He held the domain for 10 seconds, 20, 30. In that time, he learned everything he needed to know. The warp could be claimed. Order could be imposed on chaos. And the chaos gods, for all their power, couldn't immediately crush someone who challenged their dominion. At 40 seconds, Sukuna released the domain and pulled his consciousness back to real space. He opened his eyes in the geothermal chamber, breathing heavily, one of the few times since arriving in this universe that he had exerted himself enough to actually feel strain. Progress, he thought with satisfaction, definite progress. The experiment had proven several critical points. First, I can enter the warp consciously and maintain my identity. The demon essence I've consumed provides enough compatibility that the Imperium accepts my presence. Second, my domain works in the warp, possibly even better than in real space. The inherent chaos of the Imperium provides more contrast for my ordering principle to work against. Third, the chaos gods will oppose me directly once I become enough of a threat, but they can't easily destroy me. My nature as something from outside their reality makes me resistant to their direct influence. He stood, stretching his 4 arms, and considered his next steps. I need more power before I can truly challenge the chaos gods, which means I need to consume more demons, stronger ones, greater demons from all 4 chaos gods, not just Tzeentch. I need to understand each one's nature, absorb their essence, use their own power against them. and I need to practice creating and maintaining a warp presence. If I can establish a permanent foothold in the Imperium, I can draw power directly from that ocean of energy. I can grow faster, become stronger, eventually match the chaos gods themselves. A sound caught his attention, footsteps, multiple pairs approaching from above. Heavy boots, organized movement, military. Sukuna grinned. The humans had finally decided to try something more than observation. Let's see what they brought this time, he thought, and waited. The Grey Knight descended through the underhive with his squad of 10 brothers, each one a psychic warrior without peer, each one trained since childhood to fight demons and survive exposure to chaos corruption. They had been preparing for this confrontation for the last 24 hours, every weapon blessed, every ward reinforced, every mind fortified against potential psychic assault. Thaddeus himself had undergone 6 hours of meditation, centering his soul, preparing himself to face something that all his training said shouldn't exist. Brother Captain, Justicar Alaric voxed from his position in the formation. Auspec's readings show Subject Omega is stationary ahead. No other life signs detected within 3 kilometers. Good, Thaddeus replied. It means no innocents to be caught in the crossfire. Not that there were many innocents in the underhive, but the principle mattered. They reached the geothermal chamber's entrance, a massive doorway that had once been sealed with blast doors but now stood open, the doors themselves rusted into uselessness. Through the opening, Thaddeus could see the chamber beyond, and the figure sitting calmly in its center. Subject Omega, Sukuna, the King of Curses. It looked exactly as the picked feeds had shown. 4 arms, pink hair, elaborate tattoos, 2 faces. But seeing it in person was different. The picked feeds couldn't capture the presence of the thing, the way reality seemed to bend slightly around it, the sense that you were looking at something that existed in more dimensions than your eyes could properly perceive. Thaddeus activated his psychic sight, trying to perceive Subject Omega's spiritual presence, and saw nothing. Not a void, not an absence, just incomprehensibility, like trying to see a color his eyes weren't designed for. Emperor, guide me, he prayed silently, then stepped through the doorway. Sukuna looked up and smiled. Ah, he said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber, the Grey Knights. I was wondering when you'd show up. I even told your soldiers where to find me. Polite of you to accept the invitation. Thaddeus ignited his nemesis force sword, the blade bursting into silver flame fueled by his psychic power. Around him, his brothers did the same, 10 swords creating a corona of holy light. By the authority of the Emperor of Mankind, Thaddeus intoned, his voice resonant with psychic might, you are judged guilty of crimes against humanity. You will surrender or be destroyed. Sukuna laughed, no. Then he moved. The King of Curses crossed the 50 meters between them faster than Thaddeus could track with his eyes. Only his psychic precognition gave him warning, a flash of danger sense screaming through his mind, allowing him to bring his sword up in a guard position. Sukuna's fist shed into the blade with force that sent Thaddeus skidding backward, his ceramite boots leaving grooves in the metal grating. Impossible, Thaddeus thought. That should have shattered bones. My nemesis blade is psychoreactive. Physical contact should have burned him, damaged his soul. But Sukuna's hand was unmarked. The psychic flames that wreathed the blade had simply stopped, unable to affect him. Interesting weapon, Sukuna said conversationally, examining his fist. It's trying to attack my soul directly. Clever, but unfortunately for you, my soul isn't something your psychic powers can easily touch. The other Grey Knights opened fire. Storm bolters roared, mass reactive rounds designed to penetrate demonic flesh filling the air. Psycannons unleashed blasts of psychic energy that could banish lesser demons instantly. Every weapon in the Grey Knight's considerable arsenal focused on a single target. Sukuna stood in the center of the barrage and simply existed. The rounds hit him. Some bounced off his tattoos, which glowed briefly before fading. Others struck flesh and penetrated, only to have the wounds heal instantly. The psychic energy from the Cannons washed over him like water and dispersed, unable to find purchase on a soul that wasn't warp-born. "Is that it?" Sukuna asked, sounding genuinely disappointed. "I expected more from the Emperor's elite demon hunters." Thaddeus made a decision. Formation Epsilon, Psychic Assault. The Grey Knights moved in perfect synchronization, a drill they had practiced 10,000 times. They formed a circle around Sukuna, their minds linking, their psychic might combining into a single focused attack. Then they pushed. 10 Grey Knights, each one a psyker of considerable power, launched a coordinated psychic assault. It was a technique designed to overwhelm even greater demons, to burn out their connection to the warp and banish them back to the Imperium. The psychic pressure in the chamber became crushing. Reality wavered. The metal grating began to melt from the sheer psychic heat. And Sukuna laughed. "Now we're talking," he said. Then he released a pulse of cursed energy. The psychic assault shattered. Not blocked, not deflected, shattered like a wave hitting a cliff. The Grey Knights' combined might, refined over centuries of fighting demons, broke against Sukuna's cursed energy and dispersed. Brother Castiel, the youngest of the squad, fell to his knees, blood leaking from his helmet's eye lenses. Brother Mordred staggered, his psychic hood sparking as neural interfaces overloaded. Even Thaddeus felt his mind reel, his mental fortresses damaged from the backlash. How, he thought desperately, how is this possible? We've banished bloodthirsters with less effort. We've fought lords of change and won. What is this thing? Sukuna stood in the center of the chamber, completely unharmed, and his grin was wider than ever. "I'm disappointed," he said. "The psyker whose mind I read spoke of you with such fear and respect. The Grey Knights," he thought, "the Emperor's ultimate weapon against chaos. I expected something more." "We are not finished," Thaddeus said, forcing himself upright despite the pain in his mind. He called on reserves of power he rarely tapped, drawing on the fragment of the Emperor's power that all Grey Knights carried in their souls. His nemesis blade blazed brighter, the silver flames turning gold. Holy light filled the chamber, pushing back shadows, burning with a purity that could reduce demons to ash. Sukuna's eyes narrowed with interest. "Now that's different." Thaddeus charged. He moved with speed enhanced by psychic power, his blade tracing patterns in the air that left afterimages of golden light. Every swing was perfect, guided by centuries of training. Every strike was empowered by faith, by duty, by an unshakable conviction in the Emperor's protection. And Sukuna blocked them all. Not with weapons, with his hands, with his arms, with casual, almost lazy movements that made Thaddeus's masterful swordwork look clumsy by comparison. "You're skilled," Sukuna observed, catching Thaddeus's blade between two fingers again. "For a human, but you're still just a human. Enhanced, yes. Psychically gifted, certainly, but ultimately limited by your mortal frame." Thaddeus released a psychic shockwave at point-blank range, enough power to atomize an Ork warboss. Sukuna released his grip on the blade and stepped back, the shockwave passing through the space where he'd been standing. "And there's your problem," Sukuna continued, as if he hadn't just dodged a lethal attack. "You're fighting me like I'm a demon. All your techniques, all your training, all your faith, it's designed to combat chaos. But I'm not chaos. I'm something your Imperium has never encountered before." He raised one hand and spoke a single word. "Cleave." The invisible blade swept out in an arc. Thaddeus barely got his sword up in time, channeling all his psychic might into a shield. The cleave hit the shield and shattered it. The attack continued through, striking Thaddeus's armor. Ceramite that could withstand bolter fire split like cloth. The blade carved through his left pauldron, through the armor beneath, through flesh and bone. Thaddeus's left arm fell to the floor, severed cleanly at the shoulder. Pain exploded through his nervous system. The Grey Knight stumbled, his remaining hand pressing against the wound, psychic healing, already working to seal the catastrophic injury. Around him, his brothers moved to intervene, but Sukuna raised another hand. Dismantle. Dozens of invisible cuts swept through the Grey Knight's formation. Ceramite armor, blessed and warded and reinforced with prayers, came apart like paper. Blood sprayed across the metal grating as precise cuts found gaps in armor, severed limbs, opened arteries. 3 Grey Knights fell immediately, their bodies bisected or dismembered beyond even their enhanced physiology's ability to recover from. The others staggered, wounded but still functional, their training keeping them upright despite injuries that would have killed normal humans instantly. Thaddeus watched his brothers fall and felt something he had thought impossible. Despair. Not the corrupting despair of Nurgle, not the soul-crushing hopelessness that came from chaos exposure. Just simple, human despair at seeing the Emperor's finest warriors cut down like children playing at war. "You can't win," Sukuna said, and there was no mockery in his voice now, just statement of fact. "Your weapons can't hurt me. Your psychic powers can't affect me. Your faith, as admirable as it is, means nothing against someone who exists outside the framework your faith operates within." He walked toward Thaddeus, stepping over the bodies of fallen Grey Knights, and crouched down to look the brother captain in the eyes. "But I'll give you this, you tried. You faced something you knew you couldn't defeat and you attacked anyway. That's admirable, stupid but admirable." Thaddeus tried to speak, tried to spit a curse or a prayer or anything, but his body was failing. Blood loss, shock, the psychic backlash from earlier. It was all catching up at once. "Tell your Inquisitor," Sukuna said, standing, "that if she wants to save what's left of this world, she should evacuate everyone she can. I'm going to be here for a while, and I'm going to draw a lot of attention from the warp. Things are going to get worse before they get better." He turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and tell her one more thing. I'm not her enemy. I'm not anyone's enemy, really. I'm just here, existing, growing stronger. If she and her Imperium leave me alone, I'll leave them alone. But if they keep sending warriors to die pointlessly..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Thaddeus watched Sukuna walk away into the shadows of the geothermal chamber, his consciousness fading, his remaining hand still pressed uselessly against the stump of his left shoulder. "Emperor, forgive me," he thought as darkness claimed him. "I have failed." Cassandra stood in the medical bay, watching through a reinforced window as apothecaries worked frantically to save brother Captain Thaddeus's life. The Grey Knight had been found an hour ago by a search team, along with 3 of his brothers. The rest were dead, their gene seed recovered but their bodies too damaged to salvage for anything else. 3 Grey Knights dead, 4 more critically wounded, and they hadn't even scratched Subject Omega. "This is untenable," Magos Vox said from beside her, his mechadendrites twitching with what might have been nervousness if he still possessed enough organic components to feel such things. "We have deployed everything short of orbital bombardment. PDF regiments, ineffective. Grey Knights, ineffective. Probability of successful containment drops below measurable thresholds." "I know," Cassandra said quietly. "Recommendation stands, exterminatus, cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, sustained lance fire until the hive is molten slag. It is the only certainty. And kill 43 billion souls, because we failed to stop one entity. Better 43 billion than 400 billion when it spreads to the next world, or 4 trillion when it reaches a sector capital. The mathematics are clear, Inquisitor." Cassandra wanted to argue. wanted to rage against the cold logic that said billions should die for the sin of being on the wrong world at the wrong time. But she was an inquisitor. She had made harder decisions. She had ordered exterminatus herself on 3 separate occasions when there was no other choice. But this... Not yet, she said finally. Thaddeus told us Subject Omega said it wasn't our enemy, that if we left it alone, T would leave us alone. You trust the word of a Xeno's abomination. I trust that it has no reason to lie. It's proven it can kill us at will. If it wanted humanity extinct, it could have started already. She turned to look at the Magos' optical sensors. What if we give it what it wants? Explain. It's clearly interested in the warp, in demons, in growing stronger by consuming them. What if we facilitate that? Guide it toward concentrations of chaos corruption. Let it consume cultists, demons, traitors. Turn it into a weapon against our enemies rather than another enemy to fight. Magos Vox processed this for several seconds. Probability of success, unknown. Probability of catastrophic outcome, high. However, his optical sensors refocused on the medical bay. Probability of success via direct confrontation, 0. Your proposal at least offers non-zero possibilities. It's insane, Cassandra admitted. Possibly heretical, definitely outside Imperial doctrine, but I don't see another option that doesn't end in exterminatus. You will need to present this to higher authority, the Ordo Malleus, perhaps even the High Lords themselves. I know, Cassandra took a breath, but first we need to know if it's even possible to negotiate with Subject Omega, which means someone needs to approach it, unarmed, as an envoy. Suicide, Magos Vox stated flatly. Probably, but what choice do we have? The Magos didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the answer. None, they had no choice at all. His inner monologue drips with disdain. The Grey Knights were disappointing, Sukuna thought as he walked through the underhive, away from the geothermal chamber. Skilled, certainly. Well-trained. Their psychic powers were impressive by human standards, but ultimately they were just humans. Enhanced humans, but still limited by their mortal nature. He flexed his 4 arms, feeling the demonic essence churning within him. The greater demon he'd consumed was still integrating, still being broken down and absorbed. Soon, very soon, he would have access to all its knowledge, all its power. The warp is almost within my grasp, he thought. I can feel it now, pressing against reality. I understand its currents, its nature. I could enter it fully if I wanted to. Walk into the Imperium and begin carving out my domain. But he was patient, rushing in now, while he was still adapting to this universe, while he was still learning its rules, would be foolish. Better to spend more time gathering power, consuming more demons, understanding the full scope of what he was dealing with. The Chaos Gods know I exist now. They're watching, testing me with their servants, trying to understand what I am. Good. Let them wonder. Let them fear. By the time they move against me with their full might, I'll be ready. He found another warp tier, this one smaller than the others but still stable enough for demons to manifest through. Without hesitation, he reached out with his cursed energy and grabbed it, pulling it wider. The tier expanded, reality screaming in protest. Through the opening, he could see the warp in its terrible glory, an ocean of madness and power, churning with the emotions of trillions. Demons noticed the opening and rushed toward it, eager to manifest in real space. Bloodletters, plague-bearers, horrors, demonettes, dozens of them pushing through the tier. Sukuna smiled and activated his domain. Domain expansion, malevolent shrine. The technique expanded around him, but this time he did something new. Instead of just projecting it into real space, he extended it through the tier, creating a bridge that existed simultaneously in both dimensions. The demons that pushed through the tier found themselves in his domain, found themselves trapped in a space where his will was absolute, where his techniques were guaranteed to hit, where their connection to the chaos gods was suppressed. And Sukuna began to feed. He consumed them systematically, methodically, breaking down their essence and integrating it into his being. Each demon added a little more power, a little more understanding, a little more compatibility with the warp. An hour later, the tier was empty. The demons that had tried to manifest were all consumed, and Sukuna stood in the center of his domain, feeling his power swell. This is sustainable, he realized. I can create feeding grounds. Open warp tiers lure demons through, consume them in my domain. As long as I have access to the warp, I have access to unlimited power. The implications were staggering. In his original world, power came from cursed spirits and consuming other sorcerers, finite resources, limited by how many existed at any given time. Here, the warp provided an endless buffet. Demons could be destroyed and would eventually reform. He could consume the same demon 1,000 times, taking their essence each time, growing stronger infinitely. I could become stronger than the chaos gods themselves, he thought, the idea no longer seeming like fantasy but like achievable reality. Given enough time, enough consumption, enough understanding, I could surpass them, become something this universe has never seen. A god born not from emotion but from will, from hunger, from the simple desire to stand at the apex of all existence. He released his domain and closed the warp tier, satisfied with the progress. His power had grown noticeably. He could feel it in the way his cursed energy flowed, in the way reality responded to his will. Soon, he promised himself, very soon, I'll be ready to truly enter the warp, to establish my domain there, to begin the real work of claiming the Imperium as mine. But first he needed more practice, more demons, more power. He began walking, his senses extended, searching for the next concentration of chaos corruption. Behind him, carved into the wall where his domain had been active, were symbols that pulsed with power. They weren't quite cursed techniques and weren't quite warp sorcery, but something new, a fusion of both, creating something unique to this universe. The symbols glowed pink and then faded, but their influence remained. In the warp, the chaos gods felt it, a wound in their domain, a place where their power had been drained and consumed by something that shouldn't exist. For the first time in millions of years, the chaos gods felt something almost like concern. This anomaly was learning, growing, adapting. And if it continued on this trajectory, it might actually become a threat to their eternal dominion. In his brass fortress, Khorne called for his greatest champions, bloodthirsters, massive and terrible, equipped with weapons that could cleave land raiders. He would send them to Metallus-VII. He would see this upstart crushed beneath boots forged from the fury of countless wars. In his garden of disease, Nurgle chuckled and began brewing new plagues. If this thing consumed demons, then he would create demons that consumed from within, viruses that could infect even spiritual essence. It would be an interesting experiment. In his crystalline maze, Tzeentch wove new schemes. He had lost a Lord of Change, a significant loss not easily replaced, but loss created opportunity. Change created possibility. He would use this anomaly, guide it, manipulate it into serving his unknowable purposes. In her palace of excess, Slaanesh simply watched with growing fascination. Here was a being that understood joy in destruction, beauty in violence. She would corrupt it eventually. Everything could be corrupted with the right encouragement. The great game had gained a new player, and the board was about to become very interesting. In the warp threshold, Metallus-VII, 72 hours after Sukuna's arrival. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex stood at the edge of a warp tier, unarmed and alone, and wondered if these would be her last moments. She had sent word to higher authorities about her plan, had received authorization, grudging, hedged with warnings and threats, to attempt contact with Subject Omega, had prepared herself spiritually, mentally, for the possibility that this was suicide. And now she was here, in the depths of the Underhive, watching as Sukuna emerged from the shadows. He looked different than in the picked feeds, more present, as if he occupied more space than his physical body should allow. The air around him shimmered with power barely contained. "Inquisitor Vex," Sukuna said, and his voice was almost pleasant. "The Grey Knights survived, I take it. Good. I was careful not to kill them all, seemed wasteful." "He survived," Cassandra confirmed, forcing her voice to remain steady, "as did 3 others. And yet you came alone, either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which." He tilted his head, examining her with 4 red eyes. "What do you want, Inquisitor?" "To negotiate." Sukuna laughed. "Negotiate? You have nothing I want and nothing I fear. What could you possibly offer me?" "Information, guidance, targets." Cassandra took a breath. "You want to grow stronger by consuming demons. We want chaos eradicated. Our goals align." "Do they?" Sukuna's grin widened. "You want chaos eradicated so your Imperium can continue its endless expansion. I want to consume demons so I can become strong enough to claim the warp as my domain. Those aren't the same thing, Inquisitor." "No," Cassandra admitted, "but they're compatible for now." Sukuna studied her for a long moment, then he nodded. "Very well, I'll play along with your game. Feed me information about chaos concentrations, demon manifestations, cult activity. I'll consume them. Your people stay out of my way and I'll stay out of yours." "And after," Cassandra asked, "after you've consumed enough Mons, after you've claimed your domain in the warp?" Sukuna's grin became something predatory. "After," he said, "after we'll see if your Imperium is strong enough to coexist with me, or if it needs to be reorganized." Then he was gone, disappearing back into the shadows, leaving Cassandra alone at the warp tier's edge. She stood there for a long moment, processing what had just happened. She had made a deal with something that might be worse than the chaos gods themselves, had potentially doomed humanity in the long term to save it in the short term. But what choice did she have? She activated her Vox bead. "This is Inquisitor Vex. Subject Omega has agreed to cooperation. Begin compiling target data on all known chaos concentrations within the sector. Priority extremis." As she walked back toward the surface, toward what passed for civilization in this damned hive, she allowed herself one moment of honest thought. "Emperor, forgive me. I've just armed the devil and pointed him at our enemies. I pray he destroys them before he turns his attention to us." The warped perspective of the 4 gods. They watched from their domains as the anomaly continued its work, consuming demons, growing stronger, learning. Korn saw potential for the greatest skull of all, or the greatest rival. Either way, blood would flow in rivers. Nurgle saw the inevitability of decay. Everything rotted eventually, even this. Tzinte saw branching possibilities, futures that shifted and changed with every action. Some led to the anomaly's destruction. Some led to something else.